Picture a settlement so vast and so complex that it rewrites the story of human civilization. Long before the first stones were laid for the Great Pyramids, and centuries before the mysterious circles of Stonehenge took shape, there existed a city unlike any other, a bustling, vibrant community of thousands, living in a maze of connected homes with no streets, no central squares, and no obvious rulers. This was Çatalhöyük, a name that might be unfamiliar to many, but whose story is nothing short of extraordinary. Nestled in what is now modern-day Turkey, this ancient metropolis thrived more than 9,000 years ago, a stunning achievement in an era when most humans were still nomadic hunters and gatherers. What made this place so special wasn't just its size or its age, it was the way people lived, innovated, and connected in ways that still leave archaeologists in awe today. But here's the mystery that has captivated historians and scientists for decades. After flourishing for nearly 2,000 years, this revolutionary city suddenly collapsed. Its people vanished, its buildings were abandoned, and its story was buried under layers of earth and time, waiting silently for millennia. Why did it fall? Was it environmental disaster, social unrest, a slow unraveling of the very ideas that once made it strong? These questions aren't just academic, they strike at the heart of what it means to build a society, to sustain it, and sometimes to lose it. In many ways, the echoes of Çatalhöyük can be heard in our own modern cities, with their soaring populations, fragile infrastructures, and mounting environmental pressures. This isn't just a story about the past, it's a mirror held up to our present, and perhaps even a window into our future. So join us on a journey back through time, to walk across those ancient rooftops, peer into the dimly lit homes, and piece together the clues left behind by a people who dared to imagine a new way of living. Together, we'll explore the rise of humanity's first experiment in urban life, delve into the art, spirituality, and ingenuity that defined it, and confront the haunting questions surrounding its disappearance. This is more than archaeology, it's a detective story, a cautionary tale, and an inspiring testament to human creativity and resilience. By the end of this exploration, you may never look at your own city or the future of our world in quite the same way again. To understand the sheer brilliance of Çatalhöyük, we first have to step back and appreciate the monumental shift that made it possible. This was not an isolated miracle. It was the spectacular culmination of a global transformation known as the Neolithic Revolution. For nearly 2.5 million years, the entire human experience was defined by movement. Our ancestors were hunters, gatherers, and foragers, their lives dictated by the migratory patterns of animals and the seasonal growth of wild plants. They lived in small, flexible bands, carrying everything they owned, and their world was one of constant adaptation to the environment's unpredictable rhythms. But then, something extraordinary began to happen. Roughly 12,000 years ago, in a region known as the Fertile Crescent, a sweeping arc of lush land that curves from the Persian Gulf through modern-day Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, and into southeastern Turkey, humanity's relationship with nature changed forever. This was the dawn of agriculture, a quiet revolution that started not with a bang, but with a simple observation and a patient experiment. People began to notice that the seeds from the best wild wheat and barley stalks, if scattered on the ground, would grow into new plants. They learned to selectively breed wild sheep, goats, and pigs for traits that were more beneficial to them, like a calmer temperament or a richer yield of wool and meat. This process of domestication was slow, taking generations, but its impact was explosive. For the first time, humans were not just taking from nature, they were actively directing it, cultivating it, and forging a new partnership with the world around them. This control over food production created something our species had never reliably known before: a surplus. That surplus of grain and livestock was the fundamental building block of civilization. It meant that not everyone had to spend every waking moment searching for their next meal. This newfound stability allowed populations to grow, as settled life could support more children than a life on the move. It also allowed for specialization. With full-time farmers producing enough food for everyone, other individuals were free to become expert tool makers, creating finely polished stone axes and intricate obsidian blades. Others could become artists, crafting stunning jewelry from shells and stones traded from hundreds of miles away. Still others could become builders, potters, or perhaps even early priests, exploring the spiritual questions that arise when a community puts down deep roots in a single, sacred place. This explosion of creativity and social complexity was the direct result of that agricultural foundation, and it was upon this very foundation that Çatalhöyük was built. The settlers who founded this city around 9,000 years ago chose their location with incredible foresight. They positioned themselves on the edge of the incredibly fertile Konya Plain, an expansive basin in southern Anatolia blessed with rich, alluvial soil, perfect for cultivating those newly domesticated crops. A river channel provided a reliable source of water for both irrigation and daily life. More than just farmers, they were strategic pioneers, leveraging every advantage their environment offered. The agricultural revolution provided the how, the methods, and the means, but the ambitious spirit of these people provided the why. They weren't just looking to survive, they were ready to thrive, to push the concept of a village to its absolute limit and see what kind of society they could create. Their settlement was a bold, conscious experiment, the ultimate expression of a new, settled way of life that was sweeping across the globe, forever turning the page on our nomadic past. For nearly 7,000 years, this revolutionary city slept silently beneath the Turkish plains, its secrets guarded by a massive, unassuming mound of earth. Its story might have remained lost forever if not for the keen eye and relentless curiosity of a British archaeologist named James Milat. In 1958, while conducting a sweeping survey of the region, Milat and his team were alerted to a peculiar sight by local farmers. They called the large hill Çatalhöyük, which translates roughly to Fork Mound, a name derived from its position between two ancient river channels. As Milat walked across the vast expanse, his trained eye immediately recognized that this was no ordinary hill. The ground was littered with an astonishing density of ancient obsidian flakes and fragments of baked clay, the telltale signs of intense, prolonged human activity. He instantly knew he was standing on something monumental, a discovery that would soon send shockwaves through our understanding of human prehistory. When Milat and his team began their formal excavations in the 1960s, the world was utterly unprepared for what they would reveal. Their trowels carefully peeled back the layers of compacted earth to expose not a simple village, but a sprawling, densely packed metropolis of mud brick houses. The architectural layout was unlike anything ever documented. There were no streets, no alleyways, no public squares. Instead, the houses were built directly against one another, like cells in a gigantic honeycomb, creating a single, massive, interconnected structure. The only way in or out of a home was through a square opening in the roof, reached by a wooden ladder. This design forced a completely unique form of social interaction. The rooftops became the city's streets, its communal parks, and its main thoroughfares. Life unfolded above ground, a bustling network of daily activity happening atop the private spaces below. This layout suggested a society that placed a profound emphasis on community, perhaps even a form of radical equality. with little obvious distinction between wealthy elite and common folk. But the true astonishment was waiting inside these tightly packed dwellings. The walls of many homes were adorned with breathtaking, vibrantly colored paintings, the world's oldest known murals. These weren't simple doodles, they were complex, sophisticated scenes depicting wild animals, hunting parties, and abstract geometric patterns. One famous painting seems to illustrate the town itself, with its box-like houses and a twin-peaked volcano, likely the nearby Hassan Dag, erupting ominously in the background, a snapshot of a dramatic moment frozen in time for 9 millennia. Even more mysteriously, the archaeologists found the buried remains of the deceased tucked neatly under the raised plaster platforms that served as the family's sleeping and living areas. This practice of intramural burial, of keeping ancestors literally within the foundations of the home, points to a deep spiritual connection between the living and the dead, suggesting that the very concept of home was intertwined with memory and ancestry. Milat's interpretations were revolutionary and at times controversial, painting a picture of a matriarchal society that worshipped a mother goddess, evidenced by the numerous finely crafted clay figurines of robust female forms found throughout the site. His work fundamentally shattered the previous timeline of urban development, proving that complex, large-scale societies emerged far earlier than anyone had dared to imagine. However, by the 1980s, new questions had arisen that required new technologies and new perspectives to answer. This led to the launch of an even more ambitious project in 1993, led by another pioneering archaeologist, Ian Hodder. Hodder's international team brought a whole new scientific toolkit to the ancient mound. They employed techniques Milat could never have dreamed of, like micromorphology, the microscopic analysis of soil samples taken from the excavation floors. This allowed them to read the floors like a history book, identifying traces of plant materials, animal dung, and even the chemical residue of daily activities, reconstructing with incredible detail whether a space was used for cooking, crafting, or ritual. Advanced 3D mapping captured the precise spatial relationships between every object, every burial, and every wall painting, building a digital twin of the city that could be analyzed from every angle. This painstaking, methodical work began to reveal a far more nuanced and dynamic picture of life in Çatalhöyük. The new excavations confirmed that this was a city deeply connected to a vast world. Chemical analysis of the ubiquitous obsidian, a volcanic glass prized for its razor-sharp edges, revealed that it was sourced from a volcano nearly 120 miles away. This wasn't just occasional trade, it was a major, organized industry. The residents of Çatalhöyük were master craftspeople, shaping this obsidian into exquisite blades and tools that were likely traded for other luxuries like Mediterranean seashells and flint from Syria, proving that even 9,000 years ago, communities were linked by complex economic networks. Hodder's team also uncovered further evidence of the society's rich symbolic life, particularly a recurring, powerful fascination with the wild. Elaborate installations featuring bull bucrania, the massive, plastered skulls and horns of aurochs, an extinct species of giant wild cattle, were meticulously set into walls and pillars, suggesting rituals and beliefs centered on strength, danger, and the untamed natural world that still surrounded them. Perhaps the most significant shift brought by the new research was moving beyond the idea of Çatalhöyük as a single, static, and perfectly egalitarian society. The evidence began to show subtle signs of social change and even inequality over the centuries. Some houses, for instance, were larger, more elaborately decorated, and rebuilt on the same prized location over many generations, hinting at emerging lineages that held onto status and wealth. Other homes were smaller, plainer, and frequently rearranged. the story that is emerging is not of a utopian experiment frozen in time, but of a real, breathing, and evolving city. It was a place of incredible innovation and community spirit, but also one that faced the same human challenges of social pressure, environmental change, and the slow shift from shared identity to individual interest, a transformation whose consequences would ultimately shape its destiny. Walking across the landscape of Çatalhöyük would have been an experience unlike any in a modern city or even a traditional village. You wouldn't find yourself strolling down lanes or navigating public squares. Instead, your entire world would be a single, continuous, multi-level tapestry of sun-baked earth and plaster, a sprawling artificial landscape formed by the roofs of countless homes. This was a city built not outward, but upward and inward, a breathtaking feat of communal living that required a complete reimagining of what a settlement could be. The most immediate and astonishing feature was the absolute lack of streets, alleyways, or any form of passageway at ground level. The dwellings were constructed directly against one another, sharing walls in a tight, interlocking grid that left no space between them. This created a formidable, nearly solid block of architecture, a unified defensive perimeter that turned the entire settlement into its own fortress. Access to this inner world was an intimate and private affair. The only way into your home was not through a front door, but through a square opening in your own roof. A sturdy wooden ladder was the key that connected the vibrant, sunlit communal life of the rooftops to the private, shadowed domain of the family below. This architectural choice fundamentally shaped daily life and social interaction. The rooftops became the city's true public square, its highways, its parks, and its social hubs. This is where daily chores were done, where children played under the watchful eyes of the community, where news was exchanged, and where the complex social fabric of a city of thousands was continually woven together. Life literally unfolded above the heads of the private sphere, creating a constant, gentle awareness of the collective, while still preserving the sanctity of the individual household. Descending the ladder into a typical home was to enter a multi-functional space that was the absolute center of a family's universe. The single, rectangular room was a masterpiece of efficient design, every element serving multiple purposes. The floor was often covered in meticulously maintained fine plaster, kept scrupulously clean, a fact confirmed by microscopic analysis showing a remarkable lack of everyday debris. Dominating the center was the hearth, a vital source of warmth, light, and cooked food, its smoke slowly blackening the ceiling above before finding its way out through the roof opening. Along the walls were raised platforms, also plastered to a smooth finish. These platforms were the stage for nearly all of life's activities. They were the beds where families slept, the workbenches where tools were crafted, the tables where meals were eaten, and most poignantly, the final resting places for their loved ones. The spiritual and emotional weight of these homes cannot be overstated. This was not merely a shelter, it was a living archive of a family's history. When a member of the household passed away, their body was carefully prepared, often tightly folded into a fetal position, and then buried in a pit dug directly beneath one of these sleeping platforms. The pit was then sealed, and the platform was replastered, literally embedding the ancestor within the very foundation of the home. Families lived, worked, and slept for generations directly atop the physical remains of their forebears, creating an unbroken, tangible link between the past and the present. This practice suggests a world view where the cycle of life and death was intimately connected, where the home was a sacred space that belonged not just to the living, but to the entire lineage that had inhabited it. The walls of these rooms were far from bare. They were a dynamic canvas for expression and belief. They were frequently whitewashed and then adorned with elaborate paintings, one layer painted over the next as the years went by. These murals depicted a world both familiar and mystical, sprawling hunting scenes with delicate red figures chasing wild deer and bulls, intricate geometric patterns of hands and zigzags, and even what appears to be a map of the city itself with the twin-peaked Hasan Dag volcano erupting spectacularly in the background. In addition to paintings, the walls themselves were often sculpted. The most dramatic installations were the bucrania, the enormous skulls of wild aurochs, covered in thick layers of plaster to preserve their shape, with their formidable horns still intact. Set into pillars and main walls, these powerful symbols of the wild and untamed world outside served as constant, awe-inspiring reminders of the forces of nature, perhaps used in rituals to harness their strength or appease their spirit. This entire urban organism was in a constant, slow state of renewal. When a house became old or unstable, the common practice was not to abandon it and build anew elsewhere. Instead, the old walls were carefully dismantled down to a certain level. The rubble was packed tightly inside to create a solid foundation, and a new, almost identical house was constructed directly on top of the old one. This process of sequential rebuilding over centuries is what created the iconic mound, or Heruke, that we see today, each generation literally building upon the legacy of the last. This practice also hints at the deep importance of place and inheritance. A desirable location, perhaps one with a long history of ancestral burials or particularly sturdy walls, would be maintained by a single family line for dozens of generations, creating a subtle but powerful sense of continuity and potentially, over time, a form of inherited status rooted in the very land they occupied. The sheer scale of Çatalhöyük is almost impossible to comprehend, a buzzing hive of human activity that would have dwarfed any other settlement on Earth for centuries. At its zenith, this megacity was home to an astonishing 5,000 to 10,000 souls, a number that forces us to completely rethink the social capabilities of early Neolithic people. This wasn't a loose collection of farmsteads, it was a genuine urban center, a concentration of humanity that required sophisticated organization to simply feed itself and manage daily life. The rhythm of existence here was a complex symphony, a constant hum of activity orchestrated around three core pillars: securing sustenance, mastering craft, and honoring the unseen spiritual world that permeated every aspect of their lives. The foundation of this entire enterprise was without a doubt agriculture. The fertile soils of the Konya Plain provided the stage for a farming revolution that sustained the massive population. Families cultivated fields of emmer wheat and barley, the staple grains that formed the bedrock of their diet, ground into flour for bread or boiled into hearty porridges. They also herded domesticated sheep and goats, intelligent partners in survival that provided a walking pantry of meat, milk, wool, and hides. But the people of Çatalhöyük had not completely turned away from their ancestral past. The thrill and danger of the hunt remained a vital part of their culture and cuisine. Midden piles, the ancient trash heaps that archaeologists meticulously sift through, tell a clear story. They are filled with the bones of formidable wild game. They regularly pursued massive aurochs, a now extinct species of wild cattle that stood nearly 2 meters tall at the shoulder, as well as red deer and wild boar. This combination of farming, herding, and hunting created a diverse and resilient food supply, a necessary buffer against the unpredictable challenges of their environment. This agricultural surplus was the engine that powered everything else. It freed up a significant portion of the population to become full-time specialists, master artisans whose skills turned raw materials into objects of both everyday utility and breathtaking beauty. Within the confines of their sun-dried mud brick homes, lit by sunlight from the roof opening and the glow of the hearth, these craftspeople worked with a focus that rivals any modern studio. Potters coiled and fired elegant clay vessels, some left plain for practical storage, others decorated with delicate patterns. Weavers worked with looms, creating textiles from sheep's wool that provided clothing and blankets. But the true signature craft, the one that made Çatalhöyük a nexus of trade and technological innovation, was obsidian working. This volcanic glass, sourced from the distant Cappadocian volcanoes nearly 200 kilometers away, was the plastic of the Neolithic world. Craftsmen knapped it with incredible precision, producing razor-sharp blades, elegant projectile points, and finely polished mirrors that were highly prized across the region. The sheer volume of obsidian flakes found at the site indicates this was a major industrial activity, not just a casual hobby. The presence of this exotic material, along with seashells from the Mediterranean and flint from Syria, is undeniable proof of a sophisticated economic network. Çatalhöyük was no isolated backwater. It was a connected trading hub, with its artisans producing goods that were in demand across a vast landscape. All of this economic activity was set against a backdrop of intense social interaction, but one that unfolded in a uniquely vertical cityscape. With no streets or public plazas, the entire social world was elevated. The rooftops were the true heart of the community, a sprawling, flat landscape under the open sky where the real life of the city happened. This is where neighbors would meet to grind grain together, where children would chase each other between ladder holes, where elders would share stories, and where communities would likely gather to discuss important decisions. The architecture itself fostered a powerful collective identity. Your closest neighbors were literally your walls, and your daily life was conducted in full view of everyone, creating a society that must have valued harmony, cooperation, and mutual surveillance in equal measure. This profound connection extended beyond the living and into the realm of the ancestors. The practice of intramural burial, placing the deceased beneath the packed clay floors of the home, was a central pillar of their belief system. When a family member died, their body was carefully flexed into a fetal position, perhaps symbolic of a return to the womb of the earth or a readiness for rebirth. They were then buried in a pit dug directly under the sleeping platforms, the very spaces where the family continued to live, work, and sleep. After the burial, the pit was sealed and the floor was replastered, smoothly integrating the ancestor back into the fabric of the home. This created a powerful, tangible link between generations, a daily reminder that the family was a continuous entity stretching back through time. The home was not just a shelter, it was a living mausoleum, a sacred space charged with memory and presence. The walls of these homes were not silent witnesses, they were dynamic canvases that breathed with symbolic life. The famous murals, painted with red ochre and other pigments, offer glimpses into a rich mental world. Scenes of hunters swarming around a giant bull, of vultures circling abstract human figures, and of leopards with distinctive spotted coats suggest a mythology deeply intertwined with the power and danger of the wild. These were not mere decorations, they were likely narratives of creation, power, and the afterlife, visual prayers or stories meant to protect the household and connect them to forces greater than themselves. This symbolic world was further physicalized in stunning installations, like the carefully plastered bull skulls or bucrania set into walls and pillars, their massive horns arching over the living space as permanent or inspiring guardians. What emerges from this wealth of evidence is a picture of a society that, for all its density and complexity, managed to maintain a remarkable degree of internal peace. Analysis of the hundreds of skeletons recovered from under the floors reveals a startling fact. there is very little evidence of traumatic injury from violence. While life was undoubtedly hard, marked by physical labor, disease, and occasional accidents, it was not a life regularly punctuated by warfare or communal bloodshed. In a world of thousands living in incredibly close quarters, with inevitable disputes over resources, status, and beliefs, the absence of organized violence is itself a monumental achievement. It suggests a culture that developed highly effective social mechanisms for conflict resolution, a shared value system that prized cooperation over conflict, and a collective identity so strong that it could hold a megacity together for generations through the power of shared ritual, economic interdependence, and a common home. Yet for all its breathtaking artistry, the true power of Çatalhöyük's visual language lies not in its individual elements, but in the profound world-view they collectively represent. This was not art created in isolation. It was a direct reflection of a society living at a pivotal crossroads in human history. They were no longer nomadic hunter-gatherers completely at the mercy of the wild, but they were not yet fully divorced from its raw power and danger. Their entire existence was a delicate negotiation between the domesticated world they were building, the cultivated fields, the managed herds, the sturdy, man-made homes, and the untamed, formidable wilderness that still surrounded them and supplied them with essential resources like obsidian and mighty game. This deep, psychological tension between the tame and the wild is the central theme echoing through every painted wall and sculpted installation. The most dramatic expression of this relationship is found in the pervasive and powerful bull symbolism. The aurochs was not just another animal, it was a titan of the ancient world, a creature of immense strength and unpredictable fury. To hunt one was an act of incredible bravery and coordination, a life or death struggle that would have been seared into the community's memory. But the people of Çatalhöyük did more than just hunt them. They brought their essence into the very heart of their homes by carefully plastering the massive skulls and horns and embedding them into pillars and main walls. They were attempting to capture and domesticate that raw, wild power. These bucrania were not trophies in a simple sense. They were perhaps protective talismans, conduits of strength, or even representations of potent masculine spirits guarding the domestic sphere. They served as a constant, awe-inspiring reminder of the dangerous but vital natural world just beyond their walls, a force that had to be both respected and harnessed. This intricate dance with nature extended into their understanding of life and death, a cycle vividly illustrated in some of the more enigmatic paintings. The famous scene of vultures swooping down on headless human figures has sparked intense debate for decades. One compelling interpretation is that this depicts an excarnation ritual, a practice known from other cultures where bodies were left exposed to be cleaned by carrion birds before the bones were collected for burial. If this is accurate, it reveals a sophisticated spiritual belief system that saw death not as an end, but as a transformation. The vulture, a creature often viewed with revulsion today, was possibly seen as a sacred psychopomp, a guide that carried the soul from the world of the living to the realm of the ancestors. This practice would beautifully dovetail with the intramural burials, completing a cycle. The body is returned to the elements by the birds of the sky, and the cleansed bones are then returned to the earth within the home, physically integrating the ancestor into the family's ongoing story. Perhaps no artifacts from Çatalhöyük have been more debated than the numerous clay figurines, particularly the robust, full-figured representations of women. Initially popularized by James Milat as evidence of a widespread mother-goddess cult, this interpretation has been thoughtfully reconsidered by modern archaeologists like Lynn Meskel and Ian Hodder. While the divine interpretation can't be entirely ruled out, the context of these finds suggests a wider range of meanings. many were discovered not in special shrines but in everyday refuse piles, suggesting they may have been used in domestic rituals related to healing, protection, or fertility, and then discarded. Their corpulent form may not necessarily depict a universal goddess. It could represent revered elder women within the community, symbols of wisdom, abundance, and successful aging in a world where reaching old age was a significant achievement. They might even be powerful charms intended to ensure a healthy birth or a good harvest, embodying the hope for prosperity and continuity that was so vital to a settled agricultural life. What becomes clear when studying this entire symbolic repertoire is that it functioned as a powerful social glue. The consistency of these motifs, the bulls, the leopards, the geometric patterns, the treatment of the dead across hundreds of years and throughout the densely packed city points to a deeply shared set of beliefs and values. This common visual language would have helped foster a powerful collective identity among thousands of people living in unprecedented proximity. It provided a shared narrative about their origins, their relationship with the world, and their destiny, reinforcing social norms and strengthening community bonds. Yet, within this consistency, there is also evidence of individual flair. The style and quality of wall paintings vary from house to house, suggesting that while the themes were communal, the execution was left to individual families or artists, allowing for personal expression within a strong cultural framework. This balance between shared tradition and individual creativity is part of what made Çatalhöyük so resilient for so long, a society unified not by a king or an army, but by a common story told on the walls of every home. This remarkable social and spiritual cohesion, however, rested upon a foundation of immense practical complexity. Supporting a population that rivaled a modern small town required more than shared beliefs. It demanded a sophisticated and resilient economic system, a finely tuned engine of production and exchange that powered every aspect of life in the megacity. The people of Çatalhöyük were not just artists and visionaries. They were masterful farmers, shrewd herders, and pioneering industrialists whose economic innovations were every bit as revolutionary as their social architecture. At its heart, this economy was an agricultural miracle. The community's strategic location on the Konya Plain was no accident. It placed them in the midst of some of the most fertile land in the ancient Near East. Generations of farmers learned to work this rich, alluvial soil, cultivating extensive fields of emmer wheat and barley. These grains were the absolute staples of their diet, the caloric fuel that sustained thousands of people. The processing of this harvest was a constant communal activity. Archaeologists have found massive quantities of grinding stones in and around the homes, their surfaces worn smooth from the endless, rhythmic task of turning hard kernels into fine flour for bread and porridge. They also grew peas and lentils, adding essential protein and variety to their meals. This was not subsistence farming. This was surplus production on a grand scale, generating enough excess to feed not only the farmers themselves, but also the entire class of specialized artisans and craftspeople who did not work the fields. Complementing the grain fields were the managed herds of sheep and goats. This was not casual animal keeping. It was a sophisticated form of animal husbandry. The bone evidence shows a clear strategy. Most male animals were slaughtered young for their meat, while a core population of females and a few select males were kept alive to ensure a continuous supply of milk, wool, and new offspring. These animals were walking, renewable resource factories. Their milk could be drunk fresh, fermented into yogurt, or turned into cheese for storage. Their wool was sheared, spun, and woven into textiles, providing clothing that was far superior to animal skins. Even their dung would have been a valuable commodity. likely collected and dried to be used as a vital source of fuel for hearths and ovens in a landscape largely devoid of trees. But the true economic powerhouse, the industry that connected Çatalhöyük to a vast world far beyond the Konya Plain, was obsidian. This volcanic glass, born from the fiery eruptions of the Cappadocian volcanoes nearly 120 miles away, was the most coveted material of the Neolithic era. When skillfully knapped, it could produce edges sharper than any modern surgical steel. The residents of Çatalhöyük did not just use obsidian, they mastered it, turning their city into the primary production and distribution center for the entire region. The eastern mound is literally carpeted with millions of obsidian flakes and fragments, the discarded waste from a booming blade-making industry. Workshops inside homes were dedicated to this craft, with artisans producing standardized, elegant blades, lethal projectile points for hunting, and even highly polished mirrors that likely held ritual significance. This was no small-scale cottage industry. The scale of production suggests full-time specialization. These craftspeople were the tech innovators of their day, and their products were in high demand. Through trade networks that stretched for hundreds of miles, Çatalhöyük's obsidian found its way to distant communities, and in return, the city acquired luxuries and exotics that its own environment could not provide. Vivid Mediterranean seashells crafted into beads and pendants, fine flint from Syria, and perhaps even copper ornaments from even further afield. This trade was about more than goods. It was about ideas, information, and cultural influence, firmly establishing Çatalhöyük as a central node in an emerging, interconnected world. Managing the flow of all these resources, food, materials, and waste, for such a dense population required ingenious logistics. Homes were equipped with large, plastered bins for storing grain, protecting the precious surplus from pests and moisture. Water, a constant need for thousands of people and their animals, was likely collected from the nearby river channel and carefully managed, though how it was distributed throughout the city remains one of the many puzzles archaeologists are still working to solve. Waste disposal was a constant challenge. The famous midden mounds, the city's garbage dumps, are treasure troves for researchers, layer upon layer of ash, broken tools, and animal bones that tell the detailed story of daily consumption and discard. This careful, if not always perfect, management of resources speaks to a deep understanding of their environment and a collective effort to maintain order and hygiene. What is perhaps most fascinating about this entire economic structure is how it was organized, or rather, how it seemingly was not organized by a top-down authority. There is no archaeological evidence for central storage facilities, royal granaries, or a ruling elite's palace that hoarded wealth. Instead, the economy appears to have been managed at the household level. Each family unit likely stored its own grain, managed its own herd of animals, and perhaps had its own members engaged in craft production. This suggests a form of economic democracy, a network of largely self-sufficient households that were nonetheless deeply interdependent, trading goods and services with their neighbors in a complex web of reciprocity. This system fostered incredible resilience and social cohesion for centuries, as each household had a direct stake in the community's success. Yet, this very structure, which empowered the individual home, may have also contained the seeds of future trouble, as the interests of powerful, multi-generational households could eventually begin to diverge from the needs of the collective whole. For nearly 2 millennia, this intricate and vibrant system of art, economy, and social life thrived, creating one of the most stunning and enduring experiments in urban living the world has ever known. Yet, this very success may have contained the seeds of its own undoing. The question of how this society was organized, how it managed to function so smoothly for so long without obvious rulers or overt conflict, is perhaps the central puzzle of Çatalhöyük, and it's a debate that reveals the subtle complexities of human social evolution. The initial picture painted by James Milat was one of a radical, almost utopian equality. The city's most striking architectural feature, the uniformity of its houses, all roughly the same size and layout, all accessed in the same way, seemed to scream of a classless society. There were no grand palaces for a privileged elite, no ostentatious tombs filled with golden treasures, no obvious temples set apart for a powerful priestly caste. Instead, wealth in the form of valuable obsidian tools, elaborate wall paintings, and even the prized bucrania appeared to be distributed widely across the community. The practice of burying everyone under the same domestic floors, regardless of age or gender, further suggested a powerful ideology of shared identity and common fate. It was a compelling vision of a prelapsarian world, a harmonious collective that had somehow avoided the traps of power and inequality that would come to define later civilizations. But as archaeologists like Ian Hodder and his team applied more rigorous scientific techniques, this beautifully simple picture began to develop fascinating cracks. They started to notice patterns that hinted at a far more nuanced social landscape. While most houses were indeed similar, a select few were consistently different. These history houses, as they came to be called, were special. They were located in what appeared to be more desirable spots within the settlement's ever-shifting layout. Most importantly, they exhibited a remarkable continuity, being rebuilt on the exact same spot over dozens of generations, sometimes for centuries. This wasn't just rebuilding, it was a conscious preservation of a specific place, a claim to a deep ancestral connection that other, more transient households simply did not have. Within these history houses, the symbolic wealth was undeniably richer. They contained a higher density of the most elaborate wall paintings, the most impressive installations of bull skulls, and a greater number of burials, suggesting they were seen as more potent repositories of ancestral power. The evidence from the burials themselves began to tell a story of subtle distinction. While everyone was buried within homes, not all burials were equal. In some graves, particularly those associated with the history houses, individuals were interred with strikingly rare and exotic grave goods. Some were adorned with finely crafted mirrors of polished obsidian, while others were buried with elaborate necklaces made from vibrant Mediterranean seashells or beads of exotic stone that had traveled hundreds of miles to get there. These weren't just personal trinkets, they were statements of connection and access. Controlling such long-distance trade networks requires social capital, specialized knowledge, and influence. The presence of these items in specific graves strongly implies that certain families had established and maintained privileged links to the outside world, amassing a form of social currency that was literally taken to the grave. Even the bones began to whisper secrets of inequality. Detailed osteological analysis of the skeletal remains revealed variations in health and diet across the population. Some individuals showed signs of a more robust diet, with fewer markers of nutritional stress or periods of famine. Others exhibited less wear and tear from a lifetime of hard physical labor. This doesn't point to a vast chasm between a starving underclass and a gluttonous royalty, but it does suggest a gradient of access to the community's resources, where some families may have consistently had a slightly better, more reliable share of the food surplus. So how do we resolve this tension between the overwhelming evidence for collective action and the growing data on emerging distinction? The answer likely lies in rejecting the simple binary of a perfectly equal society versus a rigidly hierarchical one. Çatalhöyük probably operated on a principle that anthropologists call heterarchy, a form of social organization where power and status are fluid and situational, rather than being stacked in a single, permanent pyramid. In this model, influence wasn't necessarily inherited through a royal bloodline, but was earned and expressed in different contexts. A particularly skilled obsidian napper might hold significant sway when it came to organizing a trade expedition. A family with a long, unbroken lineage in a history house brimming with ancestral spirits would be the natural center for important rituals and decision-making. A successful hunter who repeatedly brought down giant aurochs would be celebrated and respected for his bravery and skill. This creates a society with multiple, overlapping sources of authority, where leadership rotates based on the task at hand. This system is incredibly resilient and cooperative, but it is not, strictly speaking, egalitarian. It allows for prestige and soft power to accumulate in certain hands, creating the very subtle inequalities that archaeologists are now detecting. The genius of Çatalhöyük may not have been in eliminating hierarchy altogether, but in developing a social structure that carefully managed and diffused it, preventing any single individual or family from concentrating absolute power for nearly 2,000 years. This delicate balancing act between the collective good and individual prestige was a masterpiece of social engineering, but like all complex systems, it was vulnerable to change both from within and from forces far beyond its control. This deep spiritual connection to the home and the ancestor was the bedrock of their belief system, but the spiritual expression in Çatalhöyük extended far beyond the burial platforms. The walls of these domestic sanctuaries were alive with a vibrant and complex symbolic language, a visual theology that connected the daily life of the family to the powerful, often dangerous, forces of the natural world. The most commanding features were the bucrania, the massive, plastered skulls of aurochs with their formidable horns still intact, set into pillars and main walls. These were not mere hunting trophies. They were permanent installations of raw, wild power brought into the heart of the domestic sphere. Their presence suggests a ritualistic need to harness, appease, or incorporate the spirit of this mighty beast, a creature that represented both immense danger and a vital source of food and prestige. Living and conducting daily rituals in the shadow of these symbols would have been a constant, awe-inspiring reminder of the fragile balance between the tame world they were building and the untamed wilderness that sustained them. This intricate dance with the wild is vividly illustrated in the city's famous wall paintings, which offer some of the most direct, albeit enigmatic, windows into their ritual life. One particularly striking mural depicts a sprawling hunting scene with stylized human figures surrounding a giant, charging bull, their bodies animated with a sense of coordinated action. This could be a record of a specific, successful hunt, a form of sympathetic magic intended to ensure future success, or even a mythological narrative about the relationship between humans and animals. Another haunting painting shows a series of headless human figures with large vultures looming over them. While initially disturbing, this scene may actually depict a sophisticated excarnation ritual, a practice where bodies were left exposed to be cleansed by carrion birds before the bones were collected for burial beneath the home. If so, the vulture was not a symbol of death but a sacred psychopomp, a guide that carried the spirit from the world of the living to the realm of the ancestors, completing a cycle of return that was central to their worldview. Beyond the paintings, evidence points to more formalized ritual spaces within the very fabric of the city. Archaeologists have uncovered several rooms that stand out from the typical domestic layout. These spaces are often sealed off, containing carefully arranged clusters of animal parts like the skulls of weasels or the jaws of boars, or collections of unusual items such as lumps of pigment, rare crystals, or bundles of feathers. One remarkable installation featured the remains of a young man who appears to have been buried in a specially prepared basket, surrounded by an extraordinary collection of artifacts. These are not casual deposits. They are intentional, concentrated collections that suggest these rooms were used for specialized rituals, perhaps conducted by individuals within the community who held specific spiritual knowledge or healing abilities. These figures might have been akin to shamans, mediating between the everyday world and the spirit realm for the benefit of their neighbors. The famous clay figurines, often found discarded in the refuse of daily life rather than enshrined on altars, add another layer of complexity to our understanding of their devotions. The robust female figures, once interpreted as evidence of a universal mother goddess cult, are now seen in a more nuanced light. While they may have represented a powerful deity of fertility and abundance, it is equally plausible they served as charms for successful childbirth, representations of revered female elders, or objects used in domestic healing rituals. Their context suggests a practical, household-level spirituality where the divine was invoked for immediate personal needs: the health of a child, the success of a harvest, the protection of the home. Alongside these human forms are a menagerie of animal figurines, from powerful bulls to sleek leopards, which may have been used in storytelling, teaching, or as talismans to connect with the spirit of a particular creature. What emerges from this rich tapestry of evidence is a spirituality that was seamlessly integrated into the very rhythm of existence in Çatalhöyük. Ritual was not confined to a specific day of the week or a separate temple. It was woven into the acts of building a new house and plastering over an old burial, of preparing a meal by the hearth and looking up at the leopards painted on the wall. This shared symbolic language, the consistent motifs of wild animals, the treatment of the dead, the reverence for the home acted as a powerful social glue. It provided a common narrative that helped thousands of people living in unprecedented density understand their place in the universe, forging a collective identity that was stronger than any individual ambition. Their rituals offered explanations for the mysteries of life and death, provided a sense of control over an unpredictable environment, and ultimately helped hold their revolutionary urban experiment together for generation after generation, creating a sacred order within their man-made world. To truly grasp the challenges and triumphs of this ancient metropolis, we need to step outside its honeycombed walls and understand the world it inhabited. The story of Çatalhöyük is not just one of human ingenuity. It is a story of a profound and dynamic relationship with a specific place at a specific time. The settlement's location on the vast Konya Plain in south-central Anatolia was a masterstroke of Neolithic strategy, a choice that offered incredible advantages but also came with significant and ultimately escalating vulnerabilities. This wasn't a static backdrop. It was a living, changing character in the city's long narrative, a partner that first enabled its breathtaking rise and then, perhaps, contributed to its quiet fall. During the city's founding and for much of its golden age, the climate was a powerful ally. The world was emerging from the last ice age, and the region was experiencing what scientists call a climatic optimum, a period that was significantly warmer and wetter than today. The Konya Plain was not the semi-arid basin we see now. Instead, it was a vibrant mosaic of ecosystems. Lush grasslands stretched to the horizon, providing ideal pasture for the herds of wild animals that were hunted and the domesticated sheep and goats that were tended. Expansive marshes and wetlands, fed by seasonal rains and river overflows, were rich with bird life, fish, and edible plants, offering a vital and reliable supplement to their diet. Beyond the immediate plain, the surrounding hills were likely cloaked in forests of oak and juniper, providing timber for construction and, crucially, fuel for the countless hearths and ovens that burned continuously across the city. The lifeblood of this entire operation was water, and Çatalhöyük was strategically positioned to harness it. The Çarşamba River, which flowed from the nearby Taurus Mountains, fanned out into a delta as it reached the flat plain, creating a network of channels and providing a consistent, year-round source of fresh water. This wasn't just for drinking, it was the foundation of their agricultural abundance. The river's seasonal flooding deposited layers of rich, silty soil across the floodplain, renewing the fertility of the land with every cycle. The settlers learned to manage this water, likely developing simple but effective irrigation channels to direct it to their fields of wheat and barley, ensuring these staple crops had enough moisture to thrive even in drier months. This reliable water supply, combined with the fertile soil, was the engine that produced the massive agricultural surplus necessary to support a population of thousands who were not primarily farmers. Yet this seemingly idyllic setting was also a landscape of constant challenge and meticulous management. The very river that gave them life could also take it away. Evidence from archaeology suggests that flooding was a recurring and disruptive problem. Layers of water-laden silt found between occupation levels tell a story of homes being inundated, their mud brick walls damaged by moisture. This necessitated a relentless cycle of repair, rebuilding, and reinforcement, a constant drain on labor and resources. Furthermore, the density of the city itself created a voracious appetite for resources that the local environment struggled to satisfy indefinitely. The most pressing demand was for wood. Every new house required massive timber beams to support its roof, and every hearth and oven required a constant supply of fuel for cooking, heating, and lighting. Over centuries, the once forested hillsides were likely progressively stripped bare, forcing people to travel farther and farther for firewood, a task that would have consumed ever greater amounts of time and energy. This slow-motion environmental change is recorded not in history books, but in the earth itself. Scientists studying core samples drilled from the ancient marshes and lakes near Çatalhöyük can read this history like a book. By analyzing the preserved pollen grains in each layer, they can track precisely how the vegetation changed over thousands of years. These pollen cores show a very clear trend, a gradual but unmistakable decline in tree pollen from species like oak and juniper, coinciding with a rise in pollen from drought-resistant grasses and scrub plants. At the same time, sediment layers reveal evidence of increasing aridity. The wetlands began to shrink and the soil became more alkaline. This wasn't a sudden catastrophe. It was a creeping crisis, a slow tightening of environmental constraints that would have placed inexorable pressure on the city's way of life. The impact of this gradual aridification would have been felt in every home and every field. Lower water tables and less reliable rainfall would have made irrigation more difficult, potentially reducing crop yields and making the agricultural surplus, the very foundation of their complex society, less secure. The grazing lands for their herds would have become less productive, supporting fewer animals. The already diminished forests would have retreated even further, making fuel an even more precious commodity. These environmental stresses did not operate in isolation. They created dangerous feedback loops. Deforestation likely led to increased soil erosion, washing away the precious fertile topsoil that their farms depended on and perhaps silt up the river channels that brought them life-giving water. The people of Çatalhöyük were not passive victims of their environment. They were active, ingenious managers of it, but they were engaged in a constant and ultimately escalating battle against the slow, inexorable forces of climatic change that would test the limits of their resilience. The true engine of Çatalhöyük's success, the tangible expression of its collective genius, was its breathtaking technological prowess. In the absence of metal, writing, or the wheel, the residents of this ancient city mastered their world through an intimate knowledge of materials, pushing the substances they could find around them to their absolute limits. This wasn't just about survival, it was about creating a standard of living, a density of population, and a complexity of culture that was simply unprecedented. Their innovations in tool-making, construction, and craft production were the fundamental building blocks that allowed the entire social and spiritual experiment to function, transforming raw elements from the earth into the very fabric of their civilization. At the cutting edge of their technology, quite literally, was obsidian. This volcanic glass, sourced from the distant Cappadocian volcanoes, was the supermaterial of the Neolithic world. The inhabitants of Çatalhöyük weren't just users of obsidian, they were its undisputed masters, operating what amounted to the earliest known industrial-scale production center. The eastern mound is literally carpeted with a deep layer of obsidian flakes and debris, a permanent testament to the millions of blades produced over centuries. Within their homes, skilled craftspeople, likely specializing in this trade, would have worked with remarkable precision. Using techniques like pressure flaking, they could detach long, razor-sharp blades from a single core of volcanic glass with an efficiency that modern experiments struggle to replicate. These weren't crude tools, they were standardized, elegant, and lethally effective. The primary product was the simple but incredibly versatile blade, which could be hafted onto wooden handles to create sickles for harvesting grain, set into bone handles for use as fine knives in butchering and food preparation, or used as is for countless daily scraping and cutting tasks. But their expertise went far beyond utility. They also crafted exquisite projectile points for hunting, delicate drills for boring holes in wood and shell, and perhaps most impressively, highly polished mirrors. Creating a smooth, reflective surface on a piece of obsidian requires endless hours of grinding and polishing with progressively finer abrasives, a testament to their desire for both function and beauty. This mastery of obsidian was the city's economic lifeblood, the key export that connected them to a vast trade network and brought exotic goods from hundreds of miles away back to their homes. While obsidian provided the sharp edge of their technology, the humble art of pottery provided the essential containers for their stored abundance. The development of ceramic technology at Çatalhöyük shows a clear evolution, a story of continuous improvement written in fired clay. The earliest vessels were likely simple, thick-walled bowls and jars, coil-built by hand and fired in open bonfires at relatively low temperatures. These were functional but fragile. Over time, their techniques became more sophisticated. Potters began to mix fine sand or crushed shell into the clay as temper, which helped prevent the pots from cracking during the firing process. They developed better kilns, perhaps simple pit kilns lined with clay that could achieve higher and more consistent temperatures, resulting in stronger, more durable vessels. This allowed them to create larger storage jars to hold the community's vital grain surplus, protecting it from moisture and pests. But again, utility was only part of the story. These clay canvases became a new medium for artistic expression. Potters began to decorate their wares with bold, painted designs using red ochre and other natural pigments, creating geometric patterns, intricate networks of lines, and even simple figurative motifs. Some of the most beautiful finds are fine, thin-walled cups and bowls, suggesting that as their basic needs were met, there was room for creating objects that enhanced daily life through their aesthetic appeal, moving from mere containers to valued possessions. Inside these well-made pots, one would often find the products of another sophisticated technology, textiles. While organic materials like cloth rarely survive for 9,000 years, the people of Çatalhöyük left behind clear evidence of their weaving prowess in the form of impressions on clay. When a lump of wet clay was accidentally pressed against a piece of woven fabric or a basket, it captured the intricate pattern perfectly before firing, preserving a negative image of the textile for millennia. These impressions reveal a society that had moved beyond simple animal skins. They were weaving complex textiles from plant fibers like flax and, most importantly, from the wool of their domesticated sheep. This implies a whole chain of advanced knowledge, shearing the wool, cleaning and carding it, spinning it into yarn using drop spindles with clay walls, and finally, weaving it on looms to create cloth. The production of woolen textiles would have been a revolution in comfort and practicality, providing warmer, more flexible, and more durable clothing than leather, as well as blankets and bags. This technology, born from the management of their herds, significantly improved their quality of life and almost certainly became another valuable commodity for trade. All of these crafts, the napping, the potting, the weaving, were housed within the city's most fundamental and massive technological achievement, its architecture. The entire sprawling metropolis was a masterpiece of mud brick engineering. Creating the millions of bricks required was a monumental, communal effort. They would have mixed the clay soil from the plain with water and temper like straw or gravel, packed the mud into wooden molds, and then left the bricks to dry and harden in the hot Anatolian sun. These bricks were then laid in courses with mud mortar to build the incredibly sturdy, load-bearing walls that supported the heavy timber roof beams. But their innovation didn't stop at the walls. The development of lime plaster was a particular stroke of genius. By burning limestone in specially built kilns, they could produce quicklime, which when mixed with water and sand, created a smooth, bright white plaster that was used to coat walls and floors. This was far more than just decoration. It provided a hard, hygienic, and easy-to-clean surface that protected the mud brick from moisture and wear. It also created the perfect, smooth canvas for their famous wall paintings. The roofs themselves were complex, multi-layered structures of timber, reeds, and thick layers of clay, providing essential insulation from the baking summer heat and the chilly winter cold, and creating the solid, ground level upon which the entire social life of the city was conducted. This entire built environment, from the foundation bricks to the white plastered walls to the sturdy rooftops, was a stunning technological ecosystem, a human-made shell that allowed an unprecedented number of people to live together, protected, organized, and inspired for generation after generation. If the walls and artifacts of Çatalhöyük tell the story of a community's collective spirit, then the silent remains of its people, carefully buried beneath the floors, whisper the most intimate and human details of individual lives. The skeletal record, meticulously analyzed by bioarchaeologists, provides an unvarnished and deeply moving account of the physical reality of existence in this early city, revealing a population defined by both remarkable resilience and profound vulnerability. This was a life of hard, unrelenting labor, etched directly into their bones. The vertebrae of many adults show signs of advanced osteoarthritis and degenerative joint disease, the painful result of a lifetime spent grinding grain, carrying heavy loads of water and clay, and constantly ascending and descending the wooden ladders that were the only entrances to their homes. The wear and tear was a universal tax on the body, a physical signature of the immense collective effort required to keep their complex society functioning. Their diet, the very agricultural surplus that made the city possible, also left its mark in ways that were both sustaining and damaging. Analysis of dental calculus and toothware paints a clear picture of a diet heavily reliant on processed grains. The constant chewing of coarse bread and porridge, often containing tiny stone fragments from grinding stones, led to severely worn teeth and high rates of abscesses and infections. These dental issues weren't just painful, they could have been gateways for systemic infections in an era before modern medicine, posing a serious threat to overall health. Yet, isotopic analysis of the bones themselves confirms this was a generally well-nourished population. The chemical signatures locked in their remains show a balanced intake of proteins from their sheep and goats and carbohydrates from their wheat and barley, a testament to the success of their mixed farming economy that provided a stable, if abrasive, foundation for their daily sustenance. Navigating the journey from birth to adulthood was the greatest challenge of all. The demographic picture that emerges is one familiar to the ancient world, yet no less heartbreaking for its commonality. Infant and child mortality rates were devastatingly high, with many children succumbing to infectious diseases, accidents, or complications at birth. For those who survived the perilous early years, life expectancy was likely around 30 to 35 years. Reaching the age of 50 or 60 would have been a rare achievement, granting an individual the revered status of an elder who had witnessed a vast sweep of the city's history. The risks of childbirth were a constant shadow for women, and evidence of healed fractures suggests that accidents, perhaps falls from rooftops or injuries during hunts, were a regular part of life. Yet, amidst this hardship, signs of community care are evident. Skeletons have been found with healed injuries that would have required weeks or months of immobility and support from others to survive, indicating a society that looked after its sick and wounded. One of the most striking revelations from the hundreds of skeletons examined is the notable lack of traumatic injury from violence. While broken bones are common, the patterns are consistent with accidents or falls, not with weapon wounds or defensive fractures. There is an almost complete absence of the telltale signs of warfare or organized raiding that would become so common in later periods. This finding is extraordinary when you consider the population density. Packing 5,000 to 10,000 people into such a small space, with the inevitable disputes over resources, status, and beliefs, could easily have sparked significant conflict. The fact that it did not, or did so only very rarely, suggests that the people of Çatalhöyük developed incredibly effective social and cultural mechanisms for conflict resolution, reinforcing the idea of a society that placed an immense premium on cohesion and harmony, actively working to mitigate the tensions of urban life. This profound connection between the living and the dead is most powerfully expressed in their unique burial practices. Death was not a remote event separated from the community, it was integrated directly into the home. When a person died, their body was carefully prepared. The limbs were tightly flexed and bound, folding the individual into a fetal position, perhaps symbolizing a return to the earth or a readiness for rebirth. A pit was then dug beneath the main raised platforms used for sleeping and daily activities, and the body was laid to rest. The earth was packed back in, and the floor was meticulously replastered, seamlessly incorporating the ancestor into the very fabric of the dwelling. Families would then live, work, and sleep for generations directly above their physical remains, maintaining a tangible, daily connection to their lineage. This practice turned each house into a sacred space, a living archive of family history where the past was quite literally supporting the present. These burials also provide subtle, yet compelling, clues about social identity and belief. While most individuals were buried with little more than the shroud they were wrapped in, some were interred with carefully placed grave goods. These were not the lavish treasures of kings but personal, meaningful items. A woman might be buried with a finely polished obsidian mirror, a precious object used in life. A man might be accompanied by a beautifully crafted bone tool or a pouch of prized red ochre pigment. In some burials, the remains of animals were included, such as the jaw of a wild boar or the skull of a weasel, creatures that may have held symbolic power. These items suggest a belief that aspects of identity or objects of value persisted beyond death, perhaps for use in an afterlife or as a marker of status that was recognized by the community. The care taken in these preparations shows a deep respect for the deceased and a complex understanding of the transition from life to whatever came next, a spiritual worldview that provided comfort and meaning in the face of the city's relentless demographic realities. The incredible endurance of this ancient metropolis, flourishing for over 1,400 years, stands as a powerful testament to a society that achieved a near-perfect harmony with its environment, its economy, and its own social fabric. This wasn't just survival, it was a sustained period of vibrant prosperity built on a foundation of brilliant adaptation and profound cultural unity. Their success was not the result of a single breakthrough, but a sophisticated interweaving of several key strengths, each reinforcing the other in a remarkable display of early urban resilience. Central to everything was their masterful relationship with the land itself. The city's prime location on the fertile Konya Plain was a gift of geography, but it was their intelligent management of this gift that truly unlocked its potential. The rich alluvial soil, continually renewed by the seasonal flooding of the Sarshamba River, provided the perfect bed for their extensive fields of emmer wheat and barley. This reliable agricultural base produced the massive surplus that freed a significant portion of the population from farming, allowing for the specialization in crafts and arts that defined their culture. Beyond the fields, the surrounding landscape offered a diverse bounty. Lush marshes and wetlands provided crucial supplements to their diet like fish, waterfowl, and edible plants, while the nearby hills, though gradually receding, initially supplied vital timber and fuel. This strategic positioning also placed them at the crossroads of major trade routes. Their control over the obsidian sources from the distant Cappadocian volcanoes turned them into the industrial hub of the region. This valuable volcanic glass was not just a local tool, it was their primary export, traded over hundreds of miles for exotic goods like Mediterranean seashells, Syrian flint, and other luxuries. This thriving trade economy brought not only material wealth, but also a constant flow of new ideas, technologies, and cultural influences, ensuring the city remained dynamic and connected to a wider world. This economic and environmental stability was perfectly housed within an architectural design of pure genius. The city's unique, honeycomb structure of interconnected homes was far more than a quirky building style. It was a social and defensive engine. The lack of streets and the reliance on rooftop access created a truly collective living space. The rooftops became the city's arteries and public squares, a sprawling stage for the daily choreography of community life. This forced constant interaction, fostering a powerful sense of mutual awareness and shared identity. Disputes couldn't fester unseen behind private fences. The community itself became a mechanism for social regulation and support. This dense, unified structure also presented a formidable defensive perimeter to the outside world, deterring potential threats and allowing life within to flourish with a sense of security. The practice of continuously rebuilding homes in the same locations for generations created a deep sense of place and ancestry, literally building their history into the very ground they walked on. This architectural choice brilliantly turned a potential challenge, how to house thousands of people together into their greatest social strength. Holding this entire intricate system together was a powerful and shared cultural and spiritual framework. The people of Çatalhöyük were bound by more than just proximity and economy. They were united by a common story about the world and their place in it. This worldview was vividly expressed through the stunning art that adorned their homes and the complex rituals that structured their lives. The vibrant wall paintings of hunting scenes and wild animals weren't mere decoration. They were a constant retelling of their relationship with the powerful and dangerous natural forces that surrounded them. The installation of massive plastered bull skulls, or bucrania, in their main rooms served as awe-inspiring reminders of the wild's power, perhaps used in rituals to harness that strength for the community's benefit. The consistent treatment of the dead, carefully buried beneath the family's living and sleeping platforms, created a tangible, daily connection to their ancestors, reinforcing the idea that the family unit was an unbroken chain stretching back through time. This shared symbolic language, repeated in homes across the city, acted as a powerful social glue. It provided a common set of values and beliefs that helped mitigate the inevitable tensions of dense urban life, directing collective energy toward communal well-being rather than internal conflict. Underpinning this cultural and economic system was a continuous thread of technological innovation and refinement. The inhabitants of Çatalhöyük were masters of material science for their time. Their skill in pressure-flaking obsidian produced blades of unparalleled sharpness and efficiency, tools that were both essential for daily tasks and highly prized trade commodities. Their development of lime plaster was a revolutionary advancement, creating bright, hygienic, and durable surfaces for their walls and floors that also served as the perfect canvas for their art. In pottery, they evolved from simple, bonfire-fired pots to stronger, more elaborate vessels made in better kilns, improving their ability to store and protect their vital food surplus. Evidence of sophisticated textile production, from weaving wool into cloth to crafting intricate baskets, points to a society constantly seeking to improve its comfort and efficiency. This culture of innovation wasn't about flashy inventions. It was a quiet, persistent optimization of every process, from securing food and water to building homes and making tools, ensuring that resources were used with maximum efficiency to support their dense population. A final, crucial element in this long-lasting success may have been the society's structure itself, which exhibited what appears to be a striking degree of social equality, or at the very least, a highly diffused form of leadership. The archaeological record reveals a notable absence of the signs of extreme hierarchy common in later cities. There are no grand palaces for a ruling elite, no lavish tombs filled with golden treasures, and no obvious central temples that held power over the populace. Instead, wealth and symbolic power, in the form of elaborate wall paintings, obsidian hoards, and ritual installations, were distributed widely across different households. While the history houses show evidence of emerging lineage-based prestige, this does not seem to have translated into a rigid class system with a powerful elite exploiting a disenfranchised underclass. This possible tendency toward egalitarianism, or more accurately a heterarchy where influence was situational rather than fixed, would have been a tremendous social advantage. By minimizing stark inequalities and the resentments they breed, the society could channel its collective energy and resources toward communal projects, innovation, and sustenance rather than internal suppression or conflict. This cohesive social model, combined with their environmental mastery, economic ingenuity, and cultural unity, created a virtuous cycle of prosperity that allowed humanity's first great urban experiment to not only survive but to thrive for well over a millennium, a breathtaking achievement that still echoes through the ages. Yet even the most resilient societies face pressures that test their foundations, and for all its enduring strength, the fabric of Çatalhöyük's world slowly began to fray. Around 6,500 years before the Common Era, subtle but unmistakable shifts began to appear in the archaeological record. the first quiet whispers of a system under mounting strain. This was not a sudden cataclysm but a slow creep of challenges, a gradual tightening of constraints that would have been almost imperceptible to a single generation, but became undeniable over the course of a century. The evidence for this growing pressure is etched into every aspect of the city's remains, from the very soil it was built on to the bones of its people, painting a picture of a magnificent experiment beginning to confront its limits. The most profound pressure likely originated not from within the city walls, but from the skies above and the land around them. Climate data extracted from deep soil cores and lake sediments near the site tells a story of a world slowly drying out. The warmer, wetter conditions that had blessed the Konya Plain for centuries were giving way to a drier, more variable climate. Rainfall became less reliable, and the water table likely began to drop. For a society built on the foundation of agricultural surplus, this increasing aridity was a direct threat to its survival. Lower water levels in the Sarshamba River and its distributaries would have made irrigation more difficult and less effective. The once fertile fields that carpeted the plain may have produced smaller harvests of wheat and barley, yielding less grain for the communal stores. This environmental shift placed the entire economic model of Çatalhöyük under stress, forcing its inhabitants to adapt their farming practices constantly just to maintain a baseline of production, a battle against a force they could not control. This changing relationship with their environment is starkly visible in what they threw away. The vast middens, the ancient garbage dumps that provide such a detailed menu of daily life, show a significant dietary shift during this period. The proportion of bones from wild animals, the massive aurochs, the red deer, the wild boar, begins to decline markedly. In their place, the remains of domesticated sheep and goats become overwhelmingly dominant. This suggests that the thrilling and dangerous hunt, a central pillar of their culture and a crucial source of supplemental protein, was becoming less successful or perhaps less feasible. The great herds of wild game may have been overhunted after centuries of intensive pressure, or they may have themselves been struggling with the changing climate and retreating wetlands, migrating away from the area or shrinking in number. The people were forced to fall back more heavily on their managed herds, a resource that was reliable but also vulnerable to disease and required precious grazing land that was itself becoming less productive. Within the city itself, the very architecture began to tell a story of changing fortunes and priorities. The grand, elaborate houses of the past, the so-called history houses, covered in vibrant paintings and impressive bucrania, become less common. In later layers, archaeologists find that the average house is smaller, its walls are less frequently replastered and repainted, and the symbolic installations become simpler or disappear altogether. This could point to growing economic constraints. Perhaps families no longer had the surplus labor or resources to invest in such elaborate decorative and ritual projects. It might also signal a shift in social values, a move away from the intense household-based ancestor worship and display that had defined the city's culture for so long. When the struggle for daily sustenance becomes more pressing, the energy once devoted to spiritual and artistic expression may have been redirected toward more immediate, practical concerns. The city's physical heart was becoming less ornate, hinting at a society that was simplifying, tightening its belt, and focusing more on survival than on splendor. This tightening of resources and space had a devastatingly personal cost, written into the health of the population itself. Analysis of human remains from this later period shows a rise in markers of physiological stress and infectious disease. The bones of children often exhibit lines of arrested growth, known as Harris lines, and dental enamel hypoplasia, both clear signs of periods of malnutrition or serious childhood illness when the body was forced to divert energy away from development. Furthermore, evidence of infectious diseases becomes more common. The incredibly dense living conditions, with thousands of people and their animals living in such close proximity, would have been a perfect breeding ground for pathogens. Waste management, always a challenge, may have become more difficult as resources stretched thin, potentially contaminating water sources and leading to outbreaks of waterborne illnesses. The very density that had been the city's great strength, fostering cooperation, innovation, and a shared identity, was now becoming its Achilles heel, amplifying the spread of disease at a time when people were likely less equipped to fight it. The tendrils of this internal contraction likely reached beyond the city's walls, affecting its connections to the wider world. In the earlier, wealthier layers of the mound, exotic goods are plentiful: vibrant seashells from the Mediterranean coast, fine flint from Syria, and other rare materials. In these later periods, these prized imports become noticeably rarer. This decline suggests that Çatalhöyük's once thriving trade networks were faltering. The city may have had less surplus obsidian or other goods to exchange, or the economic and environmental pressures affecting them were also impacting their trading partners, disrupting the flow of goods across the region. As these external links weakened, the city would have become more isolated and inward-looking, losing access to not only luxury items but also to the flow of new ideas, technologies, and genetic diversity that healthy trade networks bring. This cultural and economic insulation would have made the society less resilient and less able to adapt to the mounting challenges it faced. These early warnings, the drier climate, the changing diet, the simpler homes, the sicker population, and the fading trade, were not a death knell. Life in Çatalhöyük continued for centuries more, but they were the unmistakable signs of a system operating under increasing duress. The virtuous cycle that had sustained the city for over a millennium, where agricultural surplus supported specialization, which in turn reinforced cultural and social cohesion, was beginning to slow down and develop friction. The immense resilience that had allowed them to weather previous droughts or social disputes was being steadily eroded by this accumulation of pressures. The people of Çatalhöyük were undoubtedly adapting, making countless small decisions every day to cope with their changing world, but they were fighting a rearguard action against a convergence of challenges that would ultimately prove insurmountable, setting the stage for the final, slow unraveling of humanity's first great urban dream. The changing climate was not a sudden storm that shattered Çatalhöyük overnight, but a slow, relentless tide that gradually eroded the very foundations of its existence. Paleoclimatic data, meticulously extracted from deep soil cores and ancient lakebed sediments, paints an undeniable portrait of a world in transition during the city's final centuries. The warmer, wetter conditions that had once blessed the Konya Plain and made it an agricultural paradise were steadily giving way to a drier, more unpredictable regime. This wasn't a minor fluctuation. It was a fundamental shift in the environmental rules that the city had been built upon, a creeping crisis that would test the limits of human adaptation. The most telling evidence comes from the silent testimony of ancient pollen grains preserved in the mud. These microscopic time capsules reveal a dramatic transformation in the local vegetation. Pollen from trees like oak and juniper, which once thrived in a more humid environment, shows a marked and continuous decline. In its place, the record shows a surge in pollen from drought-resistant grasses, scrub plants, and weeds, the hardy survivors of a landscape beginning to thirst. This botanical shift is a clear proxy for the changing climate. Rainfall was becoming less reliable, the water table was dropping, and the air was growing hotter. The lush, forgiving environment that had welcomed the first settlers was slowly retreating, leaving behind a harsher, more demanding world. For a society whose entire existence was predicated on a massive agricultural surplus, this aridification was a direct and devastating blow. The staple crops of emmer wheat and barley, the caloric fuel for thousands of people, are deeply vulnerable to water stress. Reduced rainfall and higher temperatures would have led to stunted growth, lower grain yields, and more frequent crop failures. The fields that once produced a bounty now delivered uncertainty. Furthermore, the lifeblood of the entire system, the Sarshamba River and its distributaries, would have carried less water. This diminished flow crippled the simple irrigation channels that farmers relied upon to supplement rainfall, making it even harder to sustain their crucial harvests. The constant struggle to secure enough food from a reluctant landscape would have become the central, exhausting preoccupation of daily life, a battle against an invisible, encroaching force. The impact rippled far beyond the cultivated fields into the wild ecosystems that provided a vital safety net. The expansive marshes and wetlands that once bordered the settlement, rich with fish, waterfowl, and edible plants, began to contract and dry up under the relentless sun. This loss was a double blow. It eliminated a crucial source of supplemental nutrition and raw materials, and it devastated the populations of the magnificent wild game that was central to both their diet and their culture. The great aurochs, the red deer, and the wild boar, already under pressure from centuries of hunting, would have found their habitats shrinking and their numbers dwindling. The exciting and dangerous communal hunt, an activity steeped in ritual and prestige, became less feasible and less fruitful, severing a deep cultural link to their past and removing a key source of protein. Forced to fall back almost entirely on their domesticated flocks, the people of Çatalhöyük inadvertently created a new set of problems. A greater reliance on sheep and goats intensified the pressure on the surrounding grazing land. As the climate dried, these pastures would have become less productive, unable to support the same density of animals. Overgrazing by increasingly concentrated herds would have led to soil compaction and erosion, further degrading the land in a vicious feedback loop. The need to shepherd flocks farther afield in search of adequate forage would have consumed more labor and time, pulling vital energy away from other tasks and stretching the community's resources ever thinner. This new climatic reality also brought with it a heightened threat of extreme weather events. While the overall trend was toward aridity, the shift likely included greater variability, longer, more punishing droughts punctuated by intense, catastrophic downpours. A single violent storm after a dry period could have sent torrents of water rushing across the hardened landscape, overwhelming the river channels and flooding the low-lying city, inundating homes and spoiling stored food. Conversely, a multi-year drought could have desiccated the land, dried up wells, and led to widespread famine. These extremes would have disrupted the delicate logistics of food storage, damaged the mud brick infrastructure of the city, and created a pervasive sense of uncertainty and insecurity, making long-term planning nearly impossible. The people of Çatalhöyük were not passive victims in this drama. They were resilient and ingenious adapters. We see evidence of their attempts to cope. They may have experimented with more drought-resistant crop varieties, altered their planting schedules, or developed new water conservation techniques. But there is a limit to adaptation. The scale of the climatic shift, combined with the immense size and density of their population, ultimately created a challenge that their Neolithic toolkit could not overcome. The environmental pressures constricted the economic surplus, which in turn strained the social and cultural bonds that held the city together. The slow-burning crisis of climate change did not destroy Çatalhöyük with a single cataclysm. Instead, it methodically dismantled the pillars of its prosperity, leaving a society that was weaker, poorer, and less able to withstand the other internal and external pressures that were surely gathering force. This relentless growth, this very success that made Çatalhöyük a marvel, contained the seeds of its own slow undoing. For centuries, the city's relationship with its environment was a masterful dance of extraction and renewal, a balance that allowed it to flourish. But as the population swelled to its peak, that delicate balance began to tip. The sheer, concentrated demand of thousands of people living in one place started to overwhelm the natural systems that supported them, creating a slow-burning crisis of resource depletion that gnawed away at the city's foundations from within. This wasn't a dramatic raid or a sudden famine. It was a creeping exhaustion, a gradual drawing down of the ecological bank account with too few deposits to keep it solvent. The most visible and impactful toll was likely on the forests that once surrounded the plain. Imagine the sheer volume of timber required to build and maintain a city of this density. Every single one of those tightly packed homes required massive wooden beams to support its roof, a need that was compounded by the constant cycle of demolition and rebuilding. Every hearth, every oven that baked bread and provided warmth for a family consumed fuel daily. Over generations, the demand for wood became insatiable. The once forested hillsides were progressively stripped bare, forcing loggers to travel farther and farther afield, a journey that consumed ever more time and energy. This deforestation set off a cascade of devastating consequences. Without tree roots to anchor it, the precious topsoil, the very source of their agricultural wealth, began to wash away with every rain, silting up the river channels and reducing the fertility of their fields. The loss of tree cover also contributed to the broader aridification, as the local microclimate became drier and more extreme without the regulating presence of a forest. The city was literally burning through its own life support system to keep itself warm and standing. This pressure on the land was intensified by the very animals that provided their wool, milk, and meat. The large herds of domesticated sheep and goats essential to the economy required vast tracts of land for grazing. As the human population grew, so did the herds, and as the climate dried, the available pasture became less productive. The inevitable result was overgrazing. The animals would have cropped the grasses too short, damaging the root systems and preventing regrowth. Their hooves would have compacted the earth, reducing its ability to absorb precious rainwater and increasing runoff and erosion. The pastures that had once supported a thriving livestock industry were themselves being worn out, becoming dustier, less nutritious, and unable to sustain the same number of animals. This meant less food, less wool, and a critical reduction in the renewable resources that were a cornerstone of their survival. Water, the absolute essence of life, became another point of critical strain. The Sarshamba River and its network of channels were the city's arteries, but they were being pushed to their limit. The dense population required a constant and enormous supply for drinking, cooking, and cleaning. Their agriculture, even with simple irrigation, was entirely dependent on it. Yet, the falling water tables and reduced rainfall meant the river's flow was likely diminishing just as demand was at its highest. Furthermore, managing waste from thousands of people and their animals created a dangerous feedback loop. The midden mounds show careful disposal, but in a landscape increasingly starved of water, the risk of contaminating their own limited water sources with waste would have grown exponentially. The threat of waterborne diseases, always present, would have become a terrifying constant, particularly for the very young and the very old, adding another layer of vulnerability to a population already under stress. Even the most basic building blocks of their physical world began to run short. The city was constructed from millions of mud bricks, each one made from local clayey soil mixed with water and temper. The white plaster that coated every wall and floor was a lime-based product, requiring limestone to be quarried and fired in special kilns. Reeds for roofing and basketry were harvested from the wetlands. After centuries of uninterrupted construction, the most readily available, high-quality sources of these materials close to the settlement would have been exhausted. Procuring clay, stone, or reeds now meant organizing expeditions to more distant sources, a labor-intensive process that diverted time and energy away from food production and other vital tasks. The ease of construction that had once allowed them to rebuild their homes with such regularity was gone, replaced by a new friction that made every repair, every new building, a more costly and difficult endeavor. This resource crunch fundamentally altered daily economics at the household level. The constant background surplus that had allowed for specialization and artistic expression began to evaporate. More labor had to be devoted to the basic procurement of fuel, water, and building materials. The time once spent crafting beautiful obsidian mirrors or painting elaborate hunting scenes on walls was now consumed by the grueling work of hauling water from farther away or journeying to distant woodlots. The average person likely worked harder for a less reliable return. This scarcity would have inevitably heightened tensions. When resources become scarce, cooperation can fray and competition can intensify. The subtle social distinctions hinted at by the history houses might have become more pronounced as households with established claims to prime locations or control over remaining resource stockpiles could have leveraged that advantage, potentially leading to a less equitable distribution of the community's dwindling wealth. The very social cohesion that had been their greatest strength was being tested by the relentless pressure of ecological scarcity, a silent, slow-motion crisis that made the grand experiment of Çatalhöyük increasingly difficult to sustain. Perhaps the most telling sign of this profound cultural shift is written on the very walls of the homes themselves, or rather, on the increasing absence of what was once there. In the city's vibrant middle period, entering a dwelling was an immersive experience. The plastered walls served as a dynamic canvas, alive with sprawling hunting scenes, intricate geometric patterns, and powerful symbols like leopards and vultures, all painted in vivid red ochre. These were not mere decorations, they were a visual theology, a constant reinforcement of a shared mythology that connected every family to the wild forces of nature and to each other. Elaborate ritual installations, particularly the awe-inspiring bucrania, the plastered skulls of giant wild bulls, were set into pillars, dominating the main living space with their symbolic power. But in the final centuries, this vibrant symbolic world begins to fade. The frequency of these elaborate wall paintings drops dramatically. The walls are more often simply whitewashed, left blank and functional. The ritual installations become simpler, less frequent, or disappear altogether. It's as if the collective energy once devoted to maintaining this rich spiritual landscape was being redirected, drained away by the pressing demands of daily survival. This wasn't necessarily a loss of faith, but rather a shift in priority. When your primary concern becomes securing the next harvest or finding enough fuel, the resources and labor required to replaster and repaint elaborate murals or to source and install a massive bull skull become a luxury the community can no longer afford. The art that once bound them together through shared story and belief was slowly replaced by a stark, utilitarian silence. This changing relationship with the spiritual world found its most intimate expression in how they treated their dead. For over 1,000 years, burial practices had been remarkably consistent, a powerful ritual that wove the ancestors directly into the fabric of daily life. When a person died, their body was carefully folded into a fetal position and buried in a pit beneath the family's central platform, the very spot where they slept, ate, and lived. The floor was then seamlessly replastered, literally embedding the ancestor within the home. This practice created a tangible, daily connection to the past, turning each house into a living mausoleum and a sacred archive of family lineage. In these earlier burials, individuals were often interred with meaningful, if not lavish, grave goods: a finely polished obsidian mirror, a necklace of exotic seashells, a pouch of red ochre pigment, or the jawbone of a wild animal. These items suggest a belief that identity and social connections persisted beyond death. However, in the later phases, this careful practice begins to break down. Burials become less standardized. Some are still placed under platforms, but others are found in more haphazard locations. Crucially, the inclusion of grave goods becomes much rarer. The dead are buried with little more than the shroud they were wrapped in. This shift could signal a profound change in belief, perhaps a weakening of the cult of ancestry that had been so central to their identity, or a new conception of the afterlife that didn't require material accompaniments. More practically, it might also reflect a simple scarcity of resources. Why bury a valuable obsidian mirror when it is desperately needed by the living? The erosion of this funerary tradition points to a fraying of the spiritual and emotional bonds that had connected generations, making each household more isolated in the present and less anchored to the past. This move toward isolation is further evidenced by a clear trend toward household autonomy and a subtle but measurable rise in economic inequality. The genius of Çatalhöyük's social structure had long been its networked form of organization. There was no central palace or royal granary. Instead, the economy was managed at the household level, with each family unit storing its own grain, managing its own herd, and producing its own crafts within a wider web of reciprocity. This fostered resilience and cooperation, but under the strain of environmental and economic pressures, this system began to fragment. Archaeological evidence shows increasing variability between houses. Some households continue to be rebuilt on the same prized locations for generations, maintaining their size and even accumulating slightly more wealth, as seen in larger than average grain storage bins or a higher number of valuable obsidian cores. These established history houses might have used their generational claim to the best land and their stored surplus to weather the hard times more effectively. Meanwhile, other households appear smaller, more transient, and with far fewer material possessions. They were rebuilt less frequently and with less investment, suggesting they had a more precarious foothold in the community. This growing disparity hints at the emergence of what we might call haves and have-nots, a social stratification that was previously muted. The collective spirit of "we're all in this together" was being replaced by a more insular mindset of "my household first," as families focused on their own survival, potentially at the expense of their neighbors. The social contract was rewriting itself in real time, and the new terms were far less communal. Adding another layer of complexity to this internal transformation is the tantalizing possibility of external influence. As Çatalhöyük's own cultural coherence waned, new ideas may have begun to seep in from the outside world. The city was never truly isolated. It was a hub in a vast trade network that stretched for hundreds of miles. In its final centuries, archaeologists note the appearance of new, seemingly foreign elements in the material record. There are subtle changes in pottery styles, with the introduction of new shapes and decorative techniques that differ from the long-established local traditions. A few clay seal stamps have been found, objects that might be associated with marking ownership or facilitating trade in a more formal, individualized way, a concept quite foreign to the city's earlier communal ethos. While there is no evidence of a violent invasion or conquest, the arrival of even small groups of newcomers or increased contact with neighboring societies that had different social structures and beliefs could have acted as a catalyst for change. These external influences might have introduced alternative ways of organizing society, new spiritual ideas, or different economic models that emphasized individual or family wealth over collective well-being. For a society already struggling with internal stress, these new concepts could have provided a tempting alternative to the old ways, further accelerating the breakdown of the shared values and practices that had defined Çatalhöyük for so long. The walls, both physical and cultural, that had protected their unique experiment were becoming more permeable, and the world outside was starting to trickle in. While the remarkable peace that characterized Çatalhöyük for centuries stands as one of its most defining features, a city of such immense wealth and resources could not have existed in a complete vacuum. Its very success, built on a thriving obsidian trade and agricultural surplus, may have inadvertently painted a target on its back as the world around it began to change. The lack of defensive walls or fortifications suggests that for most of its history, the community felt secure, perhaps relying on its sheer size and imposing solid block architecture as a deterrent. But in its later centuries, the balance of power in the region may have begun to shift in dangerous ways. The gradual aridification that was stressing Çatalhöyük's farms would have also made life increasingly difficult for the nomadic pastoralist groups who roamed the surrounding highlands and plains. As their traditional grazing lands dried up and their own survival became more precarious, the sight of a densely packed, resource-rich settlement like Çatalhöyük would have become an increasingly tempting target for raids. These wouldn't have been organized armies laying siege, but rather swift, desperate strikes by small bands aiming to seize food, livestock, or valuable goods before melting back into the landscape. The archaeological invisibility of such hit-and-run attacks makes them a tantalizing possibility. A few missing sacks of grain or a handful of stolen goats would leave no trace in the ground after 9,000 years, yet a series of such losses could slowly bleed a community already on the edge. The city's lifelines to the outside world, its trade networks, also represented a critical vulnerability. For centuries, these connections had been a source of immense strength, bringing in exotic shells, rare flints, and new ideas. But a network is only as stable as its nodes. Conflicts or political upheavals erupting hundreds of miles away, in regions far beyond the control or even the knowledge of Çatalhöyük's residents, could have severed these vital links without warning. If a key trading partner to the south was overrun by a new group disinterested in obsidian, or if a previously safe route became contested territory, the flow of goods would have abruptly ceased. This would have cut off not only access to luxury items but also to practical necessities and the cultural stimulation that comes with exchange. The city's master knappers would have found their prized obsidian, the cornerstone of their economy, becoming harder to acquire and more expensive, reducing their ability to trade for other essentials. This kind of silent, distant conflict could have strangled Çatalhöyük's economy as effectively as any local drought, demonstrating how a society's fortunes can be tied to events unfolding far beyond its horizon. Another, more subtle form of external pressure could have arrived not with weapons but with people and ideas. The changing climate likely didn't just create raiders, it may have also triggered peaceful migrations, as groups from even harder-hit areas were forced to move in search of stable land and water. The fringes of the Konya Plain, with its managed fields and established water sources, would have been a natural magnet. The arrival of these newcomers, even in small numbers, would have presented a profound social and economic challenge. How would a community so deeply insular, with its identity literally built into the walls of its homes, integrate outsiders who did not share its ancestry, its burial customs, or its symbolic language? There might have been tensions over access to already diminishing resources, or a cultural dilution that further weakened the cohesive spiritual beliefs that had once united everyone. Furthermore, these migrating groups could have been unwitting carriers of new pathogens. A population as dense as Çatalhöyük's was a tinderbox for disease. Its people had likely built up immunity to local illnesses over generations, but a novel virus or bacteria introduced from the outside could have swept through the crowded homes with devastating effect, a biological catastrophe that would leave no clear archaeological signature beyond a potential spike in burials. Despite these compelling scenarios, the hard evidence for a dramatic external coup de grace remains frustratingly absent. The meticulous examination of hundreds of skeletons has yet to reveal the kind of mass graves or traumatic injuries indicative of a final, violent sack of the city. There are no layers of ash and burned rubble that would point to a widespread conflagration. This absence is itself a powerful piece of evidence, steering us away from a simple narrative of conquest and toward a more complex interplay of factors. It seems that if external threats did play a role, they were likely a multiplier of existing crises rather than a singular cause. A raid that stole a portion of the harvest would be a manageable setback in a year of plenty, but in a year of drought and poor yields, it could be the push that tips a family into famine. The stress of potential conflict could exacerbate internal social tensions, making cooperation more difficult and encouraging the hoarding of resources rather than their sharing. The true impact of the outside world on Çatalhöyük's decline was probably this subtle, corrosive kind eroding confidence, disrupting networks, and introducing new strains onto a social fabric that was already fraying from within, slowly helping to unravel the tapestry of a society that had for so long woven its own destiny in glorious isolation. So what finally tipped the scales? After more than a millennium of resilience, what combination of pressures proved too much for this ancient metropolis to bear? Scholars have pieced together a complex and chilling picture of a society facing a perfect storm of crises, where environmental disaster ignited economic and social failures in a devastating chain reaction. The most formidable opponent Çatalhöyük faced wasn't an invading army, but a changing sky. Paleoclimatologists studying ancient pollen samples and sediment cores from the region have uncovered compelling evidence of a prolonged and severe drought that gripped the Konya Plain in the city's final centuries. This wasn't just a few dry years, it was a fundamental climatic shift toward a hotter, more arid world. The reliable rains that had nourished their expansive fields of wheat and barley became unpredictable, then scarce. The Sarshamba River, the lifeblood of their irrigation system, would have shrunk to a trickle and the water table dropped, making wells run dry. For a society utterly dependent on agricultural surplus, this was an existential threat. Crop yields plummeted, and the once granaries brimming with surplus grain began to empty. The result was inevitable: widespread famine. Bioarchaeologists studying skeletons from this later period find the horrifying proof etched into human bone: lines of arrested growth in children's bones and defects in dental enamel that are the unmistakable signatures of severe recurring malnutrition. The very foundation of their civilization, a full belly, was crumbling beneath them. This scarcity of food and clean water opened the door for a second, invisible attacker: disease. The incredibly dense living conditions, a marvel of social engineering for centuries, became a deadly liability. With thousands of people and their animals living in such intimate proximity, and with sanitation challenged by a lack of flowing water, the city became a perfect breeding ground for pathogens. The evidence comes from the same skeletal remains. Analyzers reveal a significant increase in the presence of parasites and lesions on bones indicative of chronic infections in the population during the city's decline. Waterborne illnesses from contaminated sources would have spread rapidly, causing debilitating diarrhea that further weakened a population already starved of nutrients, particularly the very young and the elderly. Respiratory infections, facilitated by constant exposure to smoke from indoor hearths and the dusty, dry environment, would have raced through the tightly packed homes. This combination of famine and disease creates a vicious cycle. Malnutrition weakens the immune system, making people more susceptible to infection, and infection then prevents the body from absorbing what few nutrients are available. The community's greatest strength, its density, was now turning against it, amplifying every outbreak into a potential catastrophe. As the environment tightened its grip and illness spread, the very social fabric that had woven this city together for so long began to tear under the strain. The profound sense of equality and shared purpose that archaeologists believe defined early Çatalhöyük was likely a casualty of this new age of scarcity. When resources become desperately scarce, the instinct to prioritize one's own family can overwhelm the commitment to the common good. We see hints of this social unraveling in the archaeological record. The once communal economy managed at the household level may have fractured. Those families who controlled the best, most reliable land or who had larger stored surpluses from better years would have found themselves in a position of sudden power. The subtle distinctions hinted at by the history houses could have evolved into more pronounced social stratification, with emerging elites potentially hoarding resources while their less fortunate neighbors starved. This inequality would have bred resentment, distrust, and social friction. While evidence of outright warfare remains scant, conflict doesn't always leave bones shattered by weapons. It can manifest as tension, a breakdown in cooperation, and the refusal to share. The intricate web of reciprocity that had sustained the city for so long, "I'll trade you my obsidian blades for your extra grain," would have collapsed when there was no extra grain to be had. The social contract was breaking, and the community was fracturing into increasingly insular and competitive family units, each fighting for its own survival. This internal pressure was compounded by the potential collapse of their external economic engine. Çatalhöyük's wealth and influence were built on its mastery of obsidian. But a city struggling to feed itself cannot sustain a complex export industry. The skilled knappers, now needed in the fields for a desperate struggle to grow food, may have had to abandon their craft. Furthermore, the climatic pressures affecting the Konya Plain were likely also disrupting the wider region. Their trading partners, themselves potentially facing droughts and famines, would have had little surplus food or exotic goods to exchange for even the finest obsidian blades. The long-distance trade networks that had connected Çatalhöyük to a world of ideas and wealth for centuries may have simply gone silent, severing a critical source of economic vitality and cultural exchange. The city was turning inward, becoming poorer, more isolated, and less able to draw on outside resources or innovations that might have helped it adapt. In the end, the collapse of Çatalhöyük was almost certainly not the result of a single dramatic cause, but a tragic synergy of all these factors. A prolonged drought crippled agriculture, leading to famine. Famine weakened the population, making them vulnerable to disease. Disease and famine together placed immense strain on social structures, fostering inequality and conflict over dwindling resources. This internal crisis then crippled their specialized economy and severed their trade links, deepening their isolation and desperation. the very social cohesion and cultural traditions that had been the source of their incredible longevity may have ultimately become a hindrance, making them slow to adapt to these new, harsher realities. There was no one thing that destroyed Çatalhöyük. Instead, it was a slow unraveling, a death by 1,000 cuts, as each interconnected system, environmental, economic, social, failed in turn, pulling the others down with it until the entire magnificent experiment reached a tipping point from which it could not recover. The people didn't vanish in a day. They likely left in small groups over generations, abandoning the increasingly difficult life in the decaying city for a more manageable existence elsewhere, until finally the last ladder was pulled up, the last roof hole was sealed, and the world's first megacity was left to the silent embrace of the earth. The end of Çatalhöyük was not a single dramatic event marked by fire or conquest, but a long, slow exhale. The city didn't collapse, it simply faded, house by house, family by family, over generations. This gradual depopulation is written plainly in the archaeological layers, telling a story of quiet decline rather than a sudden, violent end. As you excavate through the final centuries of occupation, the vibrant hum of the city begins to soften. The telltale signs of a thriving community start to disappear. The meticulous maintenance that defined earlier periods, the constant replastering of walls and floors, the careful rebuilding of homes on the same sacred spots becomes increasingly rare. Instead, you find houses that were patched up haphazardly or not at all, their walls left to crack and crumble. Other structures show signs of only sporadic, temporary use, as if they were occupied for a season and then abandoned again, their hearths cold for years at a time. The cityscape, once a dense and perfectly maintained honeycomb, became a patchwork of decaying ruins interspersed with a few stubbornly occupied dwellings, a place where the wind whistled through empty doorways and across abandoned rooftops. This slow-motion exodus was almost certainly a story of pragmatic migration. People didn't flee, they simply left, likely in small family or kinship groups, making a calculated decision to seek a better life elsewhere. The material culture found at smaller, contemporary sites scattered across the Anatolian plateau tells this story of dispersal. Archaeologists find the distinct fingerprint of Çatalhöyük, its specific styles of pottery, its techniques for making obsidian tools, its artistic motifs beginning to appear in these outlying villages. This isn't evidence of conquest, it's evidence of diffusion. It shows that the people of Çatalhöyük were taking their knowledge, their skills, and their traditions with them as they moved out into the wider landscape. They were adapting to their changing world not by trying to save a dying city, but by voting with their feet, choosing to establish new, smaller, and more sustainable communities in areas where water was more reliable, where soil was less exhausted, and where the immense pressure of thousands of neighbors simply didn't exist. The reasons for this drawn-out departure were a culmination of all the pressures that had been building for centuries. The persistent drought that had crippled agriculture would have made each harvest a gamble, each winter a season of gnawing hunger. The social fabric, once so strong, had likely frayed under the strain of constant scarcity, making the complex web of cooperation and reciprocity that defined city life harder to sustain. Why stay and struggle to maintain a massive, decaying infrastructure when a smaller, simpler life in a new village offered a clearer path to survival? The decision to leave was undoubtedly heartbreaking, a severing of a deep, generational connection to a home that also held the bones of their ancestors. But it was also a rational choice, a recognition that the grand urban experiment had run its course and that the future lay in a different, more decentralized way of living. The final chapters of occupation would have been poignant. Imagine the last few hundred inhabitants, then the last few dozen, living as caretakers in a ghost city. They would have been a community of holdouts, perhaps the most traditional families with the deepest roots, stubbornly clinging to the old ways in a landscape that could no longer support them. Their world would have grown quieter and more isolated, the once bustling rooftop plazas now empty, the sounds of play and industry replaced by the silence of abandonment. They would have lived amidst the crumbling monuments to their own past glory, a daily reminder of what had been lost, and then, one day, the last hearthfire was left to burn out. The last ladder was pulled up for the final time. No single person knew they were the last to leave. They simply closed the door on a home and a history, and the city of Çatalhöyük was left to the elements, its story buried and waiting, its 9,000-year silence finally beginning. Though the final inhabitants of Çatalhöyük eventually departed, leaving their homes to be buried by silt and time, the profound impact of their 2,000-year experiment did not simply vanish. Its legacy, like seeds carried on the wind, was scattered far and wide, taking root in the foundations of countless settlements that followed and subtly shaping the very idea of what a city could be. This was not a legacy of direct imitation, but one of foundational concepts, proof of concept on a grand scale that demonstrated solutions to problems of density, community, and survival that all future urban centers would have to solve. The echoes of this first megacity can be discerned in the stone and mud brick of later Near Eastern powerhouses, showing that its collapse was not an end, but a dispersal of revolutionary ideas. One of the most tangible inheritances lies in the realm of architecture and urban form. While later cities like Jericho would famously build massive defensive walls, and the great metropolises of Mesopotamia would organize themselves around grand temples and palaces, they all shared Çatalhöyük's fundamental solution to housing a large population, incredibly dense, contiguous construction. The cellular, honeycomb-like layout may have been abandoned for streets and alleyways, but the principle of building structures directly adjacent to one another for efficiency, security, and social cohesion became a permanent feature of urban life. Furthermore, the practice of sequential rebuilding, of constructing new homes directly atop the rubble of the old, created the iconic tell mounds that dot the Near Eastern landscape. This wasn't just a convenient building technique. It represented a powerful cultural value placed on place, continuity, and ancestral connection. A value that would be magnified in the citadels and ziggurats of later kingdoms, which literally and symbolically raised the seat of power above the foundations of the past. The economic and social models pioneered at Çatalhöyük also provided an early blueprint for managing complex society. The city demonstrated that a large, non-nomadic population could not only be fed but could also specialize, creating a diversified economy that moved beyond mere subsistence. Its mastery of obsidian processing and long-distance trade established a template for how a settlement could become an economic hub, generating wealth not just from what it grew, but from what it manufactured and exchanged. This model of a centralized production center connected to a vast regional network would be perfected by the city-states of Mesopotamia, which traded in textiles, metals, and grains. Socially, while later societies would develop much more rigid and pronounced hierarchies, Çatalhöyük's apparent emphasis on household autonomy within a collective framework hints at an early form of social contract. It showed that thousands of people could cooperate, resolve conflicts, and build a shared identity without the explicit threat of a royal army, a lesson in social cohesion that, though often forgotten, remains a powerful idea. Perhaps the most intriguing legacy is a cultural and spiritual one, woven into the symbols and stories of later civilizations. The pervasive and powerful animal symbolism, particularly the veneration of bulls, finds a stunningly direct parallel in the Minoan civilization of Crete over 4,000 years later. The Minoans, famed for their palace complexes at Knossos, also incorporated bull imagery into their most sacred art and architecture, from magnificent frescoes of acrobats leaping over charging bulls to ritual vessels carved in the shape of bulls' heads. While we cannot draw a direct line of descent, the thematic resonance is profound. It suggests that certain powerful symbols, born from humanity's relationship with the untamed natural world in Anatolia, retained their potency and were refined and reinvented by later cultures across the Mediterranean. The elaborate treatment of the dead within the home, creating a tangible link to ancestors, also prefigures similar practices found in many ancient cultures, where lineage and the veneration of forebears were central to social and religious life. In the modern era, Çatalhöyük has found a new audience and a new purpose, speaking directly to the urgent challenges of our time. For urban planners and environmentalists, the city is a fascinating case study in pre-industrial sustainability and its limits. Its density is a textbook example of efficient land use, a model now promoted to combat urban sprawl. Its initial harmony with its local environment, followed by its struggle with resource depletion and climate change, serves as a stark, ancient warning about the consequences of exceeding an ecosystem's carrying capacity. Archaeologists studying the site are not just uncovering the past, they are contributing to a critical conversation about how we can build cities today that are resilient, sustainable, and socially equitable. This leads to the site's most provocative modern legacy, its role in contemporary debates about social organization. The evidence for a society that flourished for so long without obvious kings, queens, or grandiose monuments to individual power has made Çatalhöyük a touchstone for discussions about egalitarianism, cooperation, and the origins of social inequality. It stands as a powerful counter-narrative to the once standard assumption that hierarchy is an inevitable and necessary feature of complex societies. This has captured the imagination of everyone from anthropologists to political philosophers, offering a glimpse of an alternative path human community once took, and inspiring questions about whether elements of that model could be relevant once again. As a UNESCO World Heritage Site, Çatalhöyük is now protected as a monument to human ingenuity. But more importantly, it is preserved as a question, a challenge to every generation to look at its own cities and ask what we are building, what we are valuing, and whether the foundations we are laying today will be able to support the weight of the centuries to come. If the initial excavations at Çatalhöyük were like reading the chapter titles of a long-lost book, then the work being done there today is akin to using a high-powered magnifying glass and a spectral imager to study every faded ink molecule and paper fiber. Contemporary archaeology has moved far beyond the trowel and brush, embracing a suite of non-invasive technologies that allow scientists to interrogate the past without ever lifting a shovel, preserving the site for future generations while extracting more information than ever thought possible. The process begins from a grand bird's-eye view. Before a single new test pit is dug, the entire mound is scanned using ground-penetrating radar and LiDAR. These tools function like super-powered X-ray vision. LiDAR, fired from drones or aircraft, uses laser pulses to map the subtlest contours of the landscape, creating a hyper-accurate 3D model that can reveal the ghostly outlines of completely buried structures, erosion patterns, and ancient water channels invisible to the naked eye. Meanwhile, ground-penetrating radar sends electromagnetic pulses into the Earth, and by measuring the signals that bounce back, it builds a detailed picture of what lies beneath, denser walls, looser fill, voids, and hearths, allowing archaeologists to map entire neighborhoods, streets, and communal areas before any physical excavation begins, turning a vast unknown into a targeted dig plan. Once specific areas are identified for closer study, the focus shifts from the macro to the microscopic, and this is where the true intimacy of modern archaeology reveals itself. One of the most transformative techniques is soil micromorphology. Archaeologists don't just collect buckets of dirt, they carefully extract small, intact blocks of sediment, almost like taking a core sample from a tree. These blocks are then hardened with resin, sliced into incredibly thin sections, and placed under a high-powered microscope. Suddenly, a seemingly insignificant patch of floor is transformed into a breathtaking historical archive. In this micro-world, researchers can identify the individual ingredients of a meal from charred plant fragments and phytoliths, the microscopic silica skeletons of plants. They can spot the minuscule droplets of fat from cooked meat, the tiny chips of obsidian from a tool-making session, and even the distinct crystalline structure of different types of animal dung, revealing whether a space was used for cooking, crafting, stabling animals, or ritual. This technique allows them to read the sequences of daily life layer by minuscule layer, distinguishing hundreds of individual plastering events on a floor or identifying the specific season when a room was abandoned based on the pollen trapped within. The biological remains uncovered, from human skeletons to animal bones and ancient seeds, are now subjected to a level of analysis that would seem like pure science fiction to earlier archaeologists. Paleogenetics, the study of ancient DNA, has opened a direct window into the lives of the city's inhabitants. By sequencing DNA from skeletal remains, scientists can now determine genetic relationships between individuals buried in the same house, proving the multi-generational family lineages suggested by the history houses. They can trace ancestral origins, identify genetic diseases, and even understand the evolution of pathogens that affected the population. Complementing this, isotope analysis provides a personal dietary and travelogue for each individual. The principle is elegant. You are what you eat and drink, and the chemical signature of the local water and food becomes locked into your bones and teeth. By analyzing the ratios of different isotopes of elements like strontium, oxygen, and nitrogen, researchers can tell if a person grew up eating primarily meat or plants, whether they were breastfed as infants, and perhaps most astonishingly, if they were born elsewhere and migrated to Çatalhöyük later in life, providing undeniable proof of mobility and trade in the Neolithic world. All of this raw data, the geophysical surveys, the microscopic images, the genetic sequences, and the chemical isotopes converges in the digital realm. Using advanced photogrammetry, every stage of the excavation is meticulously photographed from every angle, and software stitches these thousands of images together to create precise, photorealistic 3D models of the dig site. This means that even after a layer is excavated and removed, it exists forever in a perfect digital replica, allowing researchers to virtually re-excavate the site years later to test new hypotheses. This data then fuels spectacular virtual reality reconstructions. Donning a VR headset, an archaeologist or member of the public can now step back in time, walking across the rooftop plazas of Çatalhöyük, descending a wooden ladder into a dimly lit home illuminated by a hearth fire, and looking up at the vibrant paintings and imposing bull skulls on the walls. These immersive experiences are more than just visual aids. They are powerful analytical tools that allow researchers to understand sightlines, movement, and the experiential quality of the ancient city, testing theories about social interaction and ritual practice in a way that was never before possible. This revolution in method has fundamentally changed the nature of the field itself, fostering a new era of interdisciplinary collaboration. An archaeological dig at Çatalhöyük now looks more like a scientific laboratory, with teams that include not just archaeologists, but also geoarchaeologists who read the soils, palynologists who analyze ancient pollen, zooarchaeologists who study animal bones, geneticists, chemists, and climatologists. This convergence of expertise means that a single sample, a piece of pottery with a residue stain, can be examined chemically to identify the food it contained, while the clay itself can be sourced to a specific local deposit, and pollen trapped in the residue can reveal the season it was used. This holistic approach dismantles the old boundaries between disciplines, weaving together a narrative that is simultaneously environmental, economic, social, and biological. Each technological advance, from the radar array to the DNA sequencer, acts as a new key, unlocking another layer of the profound and complex story of Çatalhöyük, proving that the past is not a static thing to be found, but a dynamic puzzle that continues to reveal its secrets to those who learn to ask the right questions with the most ingenious tools. To truly appreciate the revolutionary nature of Çatalhöyük, we must step back and view it not as an isolated marvel, but as part of a much broader tapestry of early human settlement. When we place it alongside its most famous contemporaries, like the ancient city of Jericho, its unique character comes into even sharper focus. Both cities were founded around the same time, roughly 9,000 years ago, and both represent humanity's first bold steps away from nomadic life. But the paths they chose could not have been more different. Jericho, nestled in the Jordan Valley, is famous for its massive stone defensive wall and towering circular tower, clear evidence of a society that felt the need to fortify itself against external threats, and likely a centralized authority that could organize such a colossal communal building project. Çatalhöyük, by stunning contrast, presents a complete absence of any such fortifications. Its defense was its own impenetrable, solid block architecture, a unified perimeter of homes with no doors at ground level. This fundamental difference speaks volumes about their social worlds. Jericho's walls suggest a clear distinction between us inside and them outside, a mindset prepared for conflict. Çatalhöyük's design suggests a society whose primary focus was inward, on reinforcing the bonds within its own community, fostering a powerful collective identity that may have been its greatest shield. This contrast extends into the very heart of social organization. In later Mesopotamian cities like Uruk or which flourished a few thousand years after Çatalhöyük's peak, the archaeological evidence is overwhelmingly clear. Grand palaces, elaborate royal tombs filled with sacrificed retainers and priceless treasures, and towering temple complexes all point to a highly stratified society with a powerful ruling elite, kings, priests, and a ruling class that wielded absolute authority. Çatalhöyük offers nothing of the sort. For centuries, it exhibited a breathtaking degree of social cohesion without any obvious signs of a ruling monarchy or a privileged priestly caste. Wealth in the form of elaborate art and ritual objects was distributed widely among households. This doesn't mean it was a perfect utopia. Evidence suggests emerging social distinctions over time. But its model was fundamentally different. It seems to have operated on a principle of heterarchy, where influence was fluid and based on skill, lineage, or ritual knowledge rather than a fixed top-down hierarchy. This reveals a crucial truth about the Neolithic era. There was no single, inevitable path to social complexity. Humanity was experimenting, and Çatalhöyük represents a fascinating road not taken by the empires that followed, a prolonged experiment in communal living at a scale never before attempted. Where Çatalhöyük finds a startling parallel with these later, more familiar civilizations is in the sheer sophistication of its symbolic and ritual life. One cannot look at the vibrant wall paintings, the sculpted bull skulls, and the intricate figurines without thinking of the elaborate frescoes and religious iconography of Minoan Crete or even the early temples of Sumer. The artistic impulse to depict the human relationship with the powerful forces of nature, to create a visual language for the divine, was clearly alive and well in Anatolia millennia before the great ziggurats of Mesopotamia were built. This suggests that the capacity for complex symbolic thought and profound spiritual expression was not an invention of later, so-called, more advanced civilizations, but a deep-seated human trait that found independent and equally rich expression in different parts of the world at different times. Çatalhöyük's art was not a primitive precursor. It was a parallel achievement, a testament to a universal human yearning to make sense of the world through image and ritual. Yet, for all its spiritual and artistic sophistication, Çatalhöyük lacked one of the defining technologies we most associate with civilization: writing. Mesopotamian cities developed cuneiform out of practical necessity to manage the complex economics of temple granaries, long-distance trade, and royal decrees. Çatalhöyük's economy, in stark contrast, appears to have been managed successfully for centuries at the household level. Its immense social complexity was sustained not by bureaucratic records, but by oral tradition, shared ritual, and a powerful common culture passed down through generations within the very walls of their homes. This demonstrates that literacy is not a prerequisite for a complex society. A strong, shared ideology and a web of face-to-face relationships can be just as effective, if not more so, in maintaining order and continuity, proving that there are multiple, equally valid ways to organize a large-scale human community. Finally, these early cities all shared a common, formidable adversary: their environment. Both Çatalhöyük and the cities of Mesopotamia were utterly dependent on the delicate balance of their local ecosystems. They all faced the threats of drought, flood, and resource depletion. Their responses, however, were shaped by their unique circumstances and technologies. The Sumerians responded to an arid environment by engineering vast and complex irrigation networks, a solution that required centralized control and organization. Çatalhöyük's challenges were different, managing wood resources, maintaining soil fertility, and dealing with local flooding, and were met with household-level ingenuity and adaptation. This comparison drives home a vital point. The story of early urbanization is not one of linear progress from simple to complex, from primitive to advanced. Instead, it is a story of dazzling diversity and parallel experimentation. Çatalhöyük was not a failed attempt to be Jericho or Uruk. It was a brilliant, successful, and sustained experiment in one particular form of urban life. Its ultimate decline does not negate its achievement. By comparing it to its peers, we see a fuller picture of human potential, a reminder that our ancestors were capable of imagining and building vastly different worlds, each offering unique lessons about community, sustainability, and the enduring human quest to build a place we can call home. The story of Çatalhöyük is far more than a fascinating archaeological puzzle. It is a profound conversation across 9,000 years, offering a stark mirror to our own modern struggles and a source of timeless wisdom for building a resilient future. This ancient metropolis, which thrived for longer than the Roman Empire has been gone, provides a powerful case study in navigating the very challenges we face today: explosive urbanization, environmental fragility, and the quest for social sustainability. Its ultimate decline was not a sudden catastrophe but a slow unraveling, a cautionary tale written in layers of earth that speaks directly to our current moment. One of the most urgent lessons is the critical danger of exceeding an ecosystem's carrying capacity. The people of Çatalhöyük were brilliant adapters, but their very success contained the seeds of vulnerability. For centuries, they managed their local environment with ingenuity, but the relentless demand of a megacity slowly eroded its own foundation. The insatiable need for wood led to deforestation of the surrounding hillsides, which in turn triggered soil erosion and likely contributed to a drier local climate. Their large herds of domesticated animals, essential for survival, began to overgraze the pastures, reducing their productivity. This story of incremental resource depletion is not an ancient anomaly. It is a global reality today. We see it in the massive deforestation of the Amazon, the critical overdrawing of aquifers for agriculture, and the collapsing fish stocks in our oceans. Çatalhöyük teaches us that no society, no matter how ingenious, is immune to the laws of nature. A thriving economy built upon the unsustainable drawdown of natural capital is, by its very definition, a temporary arrangement. Their experience urges us to shift from a model of extraction to one of regeneration, to measure our progress not just by GDP, but by the health of the ecosystems that support us. Yet, their story also illuminates a path forward, emphasizing that our greatest resource in facing these challenges is not technology alone, but each other. What held Çatalhöyük together for so long was not a powerful king or a standing army, but a powerful sense of community and a web of cooperation. The very architecture of the city, with its interconnected homes and shared rooftop plazas, forced constant interaction and fostered a collective identity. For nearly 2 millennia, they maintained a remarkable degree of internal peace, resolving conflicts through social mechanisms rather than violence. This highlights a crucial insight often lost in our search for technological silver bullets. While innovation is vital, it is insufficient without the social cohesion to implement solutions fairly and effectively. In an era of deepening political and social fractures, Çatalhöyük stands as a testament to the resilience born from strong community bonds, mutual aid, and a shared sense of purpose. It suggests that building storm-proof cities is less about higher seawalls and more about stronger neighborhoods, where people are connected and invested in each other's well-being. Perhaps the most comforting and challenging lesson from Çatalhöyük is a reframing of what collapse truly means. For the final inhabitants, leaving the city was not a failure. It was an adaptation, a pragmatic choice for a more sustainable life elsewhere. They did not vanish, they dispersed, taking their knowledge and traditions to seed new, smaller communities across the landscape. This perspective encourages us to move beyond a binary thinking of saving our way of life versus apocalyptic collapse. Instead, it invites us to think proactively about managed transition, graceful decline, and intentional transformation. What if, instead of fighting desperately to preserve every aspect of our current systems, we focused on designing a thoughtful transition to a different, more balanced future? This could mean planned relocations from vulnerable coastal areas, a deliberate shift away from resource-intensive industries, or the nurturing of local, circular economies. Çatalhöyük's abandonment was a process, not an event, and it is in that process that we find agency. By studying their gradual adaptation, we are empowered to start making those necessary, if difficult, transitions now on our own terms, rather than being forced into them by crisis later. Finally, the city's breathtaking longevity over 70 generations is a powerful lesson in the value of flexibility and embedded innovation. They were not static. Their culture, economy, and rituals evolved significantly over time. They mastered new technologies like advanced pottery kilns and plaster production, and their social structures showed subtle shifts in response to changing conditions. This demonstrates that resilience is not about stubbornly resisting change, but about cultivating the capacity to adapt to it. A resilient system has buffers, redundancy, and the ability to learn and reorganize. For us, this means building flexibility into our infrastructure, our economies, and our institutions. It means valuing diversity of crops, of energy sources, of ideas, so that we are not vulnerable to a single point of failure. Çatalhöyük's greatest legacy is this proof that a society can achieve incredible stability not through rigidity, but through a deep, enduring capacity to evolve in harmony with a changing world, a lesson we must urgently heed to navigate the uncertain centuries ahead. Even after decades of meticulous excavation and cutting-edge analysis, Çatalhöyük guards its deepest secrets with a silent, stubborn resolve. We have mapped its streets of rooftops, catalogued its art, and studied its bones, yet the most fundamental questions about its inner life remain shrouded in a mist of 9,000 years. The precise catalyst for its eventual decline is perhaps the greatest of these enigmas, a complex puzzle that refuses a simple solution. We can trace the environmental pressures, the creeping drought, the depleted forests, the strained resources, but these factors alone don't tell the whole story. Did a final, catastrophic event, like a pandemic leaping through those densely packed homes, deliver the final blow? Or was it a slow, generational sigh of resignation, as one family after another made the pragmatic choice to seek a simpler life elsewhere, until the collective spirit of the place simply evaporated? The evidence points not to a single villain, but to a perfect storm of interconnected crises, a sobering reminder that civilizations are complex ecosystems, and their collapse is rarely due to one cause alone. The stunning visual world they left behind is another magnificent riddle. The meaning of those vibrant murals and powerful installations continues to be hotly debated by experts. Were the sprawling hunting scenes literal records of great triumphs, a form of historical documentation painted on plaster? Or were they acts of sympathetic magic, intricate prayers rendered in ochre to ensure success in future hunts? The famous vulture mural, with its headless human figures, could depict a spiritual excarnation ritual, or it might represent a darker mythological narrative about death and the afterlife, a story we will never fully hear. The plastered bull skulls set into the walls radiate a powerful, awe-inspiring presence even today, but were they protective talismans, symbols of a potent deity, or the revered trophies of a particularly revered lineage of hunters? Each interpretation opens a different window into their mindset, and the frustrating, beautiful truth is that they are all potentially valid. Their art is a language without a Rosetta Stone, its grammar and vocabulary lost to time, leaving us to admire its fluency without being able to fully read its verses. This ambiguity extends to the very structure of their society. The initial vision of Çatalhöyük as a perfectly egalitarian utopia has given way to a much more nuanced and therefore more mysterious reality. The uniformity of the houses suggests a remarkable degree of social cohesion, but the emergence of history houses, dwellings rebuilt for generations in the same prime locations and filled with greater symbolic wealth, hints at subtle inherited status. Was this a society where influence was fluid, earned through skill in hunting, trade, or ritual knowledge, a system anthropologists call heteroarchy? Or were there quiet, underlying hierarchies based on lineage that simply didn't express themselves in the grandiose palaces and royal tombs we see in later periods? The answer is crucial to understanding what truly held this city together for so long. How did they resolve the inevitable disputes that arise when thousands of people live literally on top of one another, with no evidence of a central ruling authority or a formal legal system? Was justice mediated through respected elders within each neighborhood, or through communal pressure and a shared cultural value on harmony? The silent archaeology provides clues but never the full transcript of their social contract. And what of the human experience itself, the sounds and sensations that truly brought this place to life? We can reconstruct their diet from discarded bones and analyze their health from their skeletons, but we cannot hear their world. What language did they speak? What stories did they tell their children under the glow of the hearth? Did songs echo across the rooftop plazas at sunset? And what melodies and rhythms did they use? The acoustic properties of their small, plastered rooms would have made conversations intimate and rituals intensely immersive, but the content of those speeches and chants is a void we can never fill. Similarly, the role of women is particularly enigmatic. The famous corpulent figurines were once confidently interpreted as evidence of a mother goddess cult, suggesting a matriarchal or matrilineal society. Modern scholarship is far more cautious, pointing out that these objects are often found in domestic refuse, suggesting they could be personal talismans for fertility or health, representations of revered elder women, or even children's toys. Without written records, the nuances of gender dynamics, the division of labor, and the structure of the family remain open to interpretation, informed by evidence but never finally settled. It is these very mysteries, however, that make Çatalhöyük such an endlessly fertile ground for discovery. Each season of excavation, each new technological advancement, provides not just answers but better, more precise questions. The use of ancient DNA analysis is now tracing genetic lineages between those buried beneath the same house, testing the history house theory with hard biological data. Chemical analysis of residues on pottery and tools tells us not just what they ate, but how they prepared and shared their food, offering glimpses into the rhythms of daily life and ritual feasting. These unanswered questions are not a failure of archaeology, they are its engine. They ensure that Çatalhöyük is not a static exhibit in a museum, but a living, breathing field of inquiry, a constant dialogue between the present and the deep past. Every new discovery adds a piece to the puzzle, but it also reveals the breathtaking complexity of the entire picture, reminding us that the first city still has so much to teach us about the enduring human experiment of living together. The echoes of Çatalhöyük's final silence do not signal an end, but an invitation, a profound opportunity to reflect on the entire breathtaking arc of humanity's first great urban experiment. Its story is not a simple tale of rise and fall, but a complex narrative of dazzling innovation, resilient community, and ultimately, a quiet reckoning with the immutable limits of the ancient world. For over 1,500 years, this city stood as a stunning testament to what human beings could achieve when they chose to build together, a vibrant, pulsing heart of art, ritual, and commerce that hummed with a life unlike anything the world had ever seen. Its residents were not primitive cave dwellers, they were master architects, ingenious engineers, visionary artists, and global traders who created a society of breathtaking complexity without the crutch of written language or the whip of an all-powerful king. They proved that urbanization could blossom from a foundation of shared values and mutual cooperation, a powerful alternative model to the top-down hierarchies that would later define so many civilizations. Yet, the very ingredients of their spectacular success also contained the subtle seeds of their vulnerability. Their incredible density, a marvel of social engineering, became a liability when disease swept through their crowded homes. Their agricultural surplus, the engine of their specialized economy, faltered when the climate shifted and the rains failed. Their seemingly egalitarian spirit showed signs of strain as resources dwindled, and some households began to cling more tightly to their generational advantages. Çatalhöyük's decline was a slow-motion unraveling, a lesson in how a multitude of pressures, environmental, economic, and social, can converge, each one exacerbating the other, until a system that once seemed unbreakable reaches a tipping point. There was no single villain, no invading horde or cataclysmic volcano that delivered the final blow. Instead, it was a gradual fading, a series of pragmatic, heartbreaking choices made by families over generations to seek a simpler, more sustainable life elsewhere. This ancient story resonates with a chilling and urgent clarity in our modern world. We too live in an age of megacities, of incredible density and technological marvel. We too face the escalating pressures of a changing climate, watching as droughts intensify, resources are stretched thin, and the very ecosystems that support us show signs of profound stress. The questions that haunted the final centuries of Çatalhöyük are the very ones we grapple with today. How do we manage the resources of a finite planet to support billions of people? How do we maintain social cohesion and equity in the face of scarcity? How do we build resilience into the very bones of our societies so they can bend without breaking under the strain of inevitable crises? The people of Çatalhöyük offer no simple answers, but they provide a priceless, long-term case study. Their 2,000-year run is a testament to the power of community, adaptation, and a deep connection to place. Their eventual dispersal is a sobering reminder that growth cannot be infinite on a finite planet. Ultimately, to walk through the silent, excavated rooms of Çatalhöyük is to engage in a conversation with our own humanity. It pushes us to look beyond the simplistic notion of collapse and to see instead a process of transformation. The city's end was not an extinction, it was a diaspora. Its people carried their knowledge, their genes, and their traditions out into the wider world, seeding new communities and influencing the cultures that would follow. Their legacy is not a ruined mound in Turkey, but the very idea of the city itself, a bold, audacious experiment in living together that continues to this day. As we face an uncertain future, their story grants us a precious gift: perspective. It reminds us that our current way of life is not the only one possible, and that true resilience might lie not in stubbornly preserving the status quo, but in our collective capacity to adapt, to change, and to imagine new ways of being together on this planet. The lessons of Çatalhöyük are etched not in stone, but in the enduring human spirit, a spirit of incredible creativity, profound cooperation, and an unyielding hope for the future.